on millions of people's minds. And you know what? The answer might be a lot closer than you think. Today, we're going to cut through all the noise and look at the real, concrete economic signals that could actually trigger that next wave of support. Look, this is the question, right? It's probably one of the most common questions being asked right now. And if you're wondering about it, you are definitely not alone. The fact that so many people are even asking tells its own story. A lot of folks are feeling the financial squeeze. But to find the real answer, we can't just look at our own finances. We have to look somewhere else entirely. And this is the fundamental idea we have to start with. A stimulus check, sure, it feels incredibly personal. It lands right in your bank account. But where it comes from? Not personal at all. You have to think of it like a giant emergency lever the government pulls when the entire economic engine of the country starts to stall. They're not trying to fix your personal budget, they're trying to fix the country's economy. Okay, let's really break this down because this gets right to the heart of everything. On one side, you have the common assumption, which makes total sense. People are hurting, they need help, so the government should help. It's logical. But on the other side, you have the economic reality. The government really only acts when the entire economy is in trouble, when it's shrinking, when it's heading for a recession. Those stimulus checks we get are really just a side effect of that much bigger problem. The economy is the patient, and the stimulus check is the emergency medicine. So if we're going to be economic detectives, watching for these signs of weakness, where do we look first? Well, there is one single report that stands head and shoulders above all the rest. It's the most important vital sign for the U.S. economy, and that is the monthly jobs report. Every first Friday of the month, this report drops, and it's basically a national health checkup. It's the biggest barometer we've got. Now, the unemployment rate, that's the headline number everyone talks about. But the details inside are what really tell the story. You see things like average hourly earnings. Are people's wages actually keeping up with prices? And maybe the most important one is the labor participation rate. That tells us if people are so discouraged that they've just given up looking for a job altogether. Put it all together and you get a really clear picture of whether the economy is creating jobs or losing them. I want you to just look at this number for a second. 1.8 million. It's a huge, huge figure. What in the world could that represent? Well, this number is the key to understanding why even tiny little changes in that jobs report have absolutely massive consequences. And there it is. For every single percentage point the unemployment rate goes up, another 1.8 million people have lost their jobs. Just let that sink in. A headline might say unemployment ticked up by 0.1%. That sounds like nothing, right? But that tiny tick means 180,000 people are suddenly out of work. It's not just a statistic. It's a huge wave of disruption hitting families and towns all across the country. And that disruption, it doesn't stop there. This is where we see the snowball effect. It's what economists call a vicious cycle. You see, a weak job market isn't just a one-time thing. It's the start of a chain reaction that can pull the whole economy down. It starts out pretty slow, but believe me, it picks up speed really, really fast. Let's walk through this dangerous cycle. So first, the unemployment rate starts to climb. What happens next? Well, naturally, when people lose their paychecks, they stop spending money. So step 2, consumer spending falls. People put off buying that car or fixing the roof or even just eating out. Then, because customers aren't buying, businesses see their sales drop. So step 3, they contract. They cut back, they cancel plans, and eventually, they have to do more layoffs. And that, of course, leads to step 4, pushing the unemployment rate even higher. You see how this works? The cycle just keeps feeding on itself, getting worse each time around. This quote just captures it perfectly. The government is watching this cycle gain speed and momentum. They know that once it really gets going, it's incredibly hard to stop. And that exact moment, when that cycle is threatening to spiral, that's when stimulus checks go from being a vague idea to an urgent plan. The whole point of a stimulus check is to jump right into step 2, to boost consumer spending and try to break that cycle before it gets any worse. So the jobs report is signal number 1 for sure, but there's another really crucial indicator that tells the same story, what the Federal Reserve is doing with interest rates. Watching the Fed gives us a peek behind the curtain at their private assessment of how the economy is really doing. It's really a tale of 2 different approaches. When the economy is running hot and growing fast, the Fed worries about inflation. So they raise interest rates to make borrowing money more expensive, which kind of cools everything down. But the opposite is also true. When the Fed starts cutting interest rates, that is a crystal clear signal that they think the economy is weak and needs a boost. They're making it cheaper to borrow money to try and get businesses and people spending again. And this brings us to a super important rule of thumb. When you see the Federal Reserve start aggressively cutting interest rates, even if officials are on TV saying the economy is strong, you need to pay attention to what they do, not what they say. Those rate cuts are a hidden signal. They're a quiet admission that behind the scenes, the data they're looking at is worrying enough to step in. They're trying to get ahead of a bigger problem. And this isn't just some abstract theory. This link between a weak economy and a big government response is a very well-established pattern. In fact, if you look back at every major recession we've had in recent memory, the playbook is remarkably consistent. I mean, the historical record here is undeniable. In 2001, after the tech bubble popped, boom, we got stimulus checks. In 2008, during the Great Financial Crisis, boom, stimulus checks. And in 2020, when the pandemic started, boom, we got multiple rounds of stimulus checks. Every single major economic downturn in the last 25 years has been met with the exact same response. It's just become a standard tool in the economic toolkit. This quote from one of the sources just says it all, doesn't it? The response is predictable. When the economy hits a major wall, rising unemployment, shrinking growth, the government and the Fed act. They cut interest rates and they send out money. History shows us this isn't really an if question anymore. It's a when question.
Now, a lot of us think the government is just too slow to react. But when a real crisis hits, they can move with incredible speed. Let's just look at the example from late 2020. A stimulus bill was signed into law on December 28th. The very next day, December 29th, direct deposits were already starting to hit people's bank accounts. Within a week, almost everyone had their money. The point is, the system is already built. When they decide to turn on the faucet, the money can flow almost immediately.
So, this really brings us to the ultimate takeaway. We need to shift how we think about this. The real question isn't if the government will do this again. History tells us they will. The real question is, what's the pain threshold? How bad does the economy have to get? How high does unemployment have to climb before they're finally forced to pull that lever one more time? By understanding these signals, the jobs report, what the Fed is doing, the historical pattern, you're now equipped to watch the economy for yourself. So the next time you see a headline about the unemployment rate ticking up, you'll know it isn't just a number, it's a signal. And the real question is, how many more of those signals will we need to see before action becomes inevitable?
This quote, it just hits home, doesn't it? It's a feeling so many people share. You wait all year for that cost of living adjustment, you're hoping it'll finally give you some breathing room, and then, poof, rising costs have already eaten it up before you even get it. It's this incredibly frustrating cycle, and it's the exact problem that these proposals are trying to fix.
So, to make this all super clear, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the financial squeeze that's making all of this so necessary. Then we'll get into two huge proposals for a Social Security lifeline. After that, we'll see the plan for fixing that annual raise. Then we'll cover some other really critical help that's on the table. And finally, we'll wrap it all up and talk about what this could really mean for you.
So, let's start right there with the core issue, the financial squeeze. I mean, why does it feel like you're running backwards, even when you technically get a raise every year? Well, the numbers, they tell a pretty clear story. This all comes down to something called purchasing power. And it's not about the dollar amount printed on your check. It's about what those dollars can actually buy. Losing 20% is, well, it's staggering. It means that the same amount of money that bought you 5 bags of groceries 10 years ago might only get you 4 bags today. It's this slow, quiet erosion of your money's value, and it's the big problem that really needs a solution.
And here is where you can see the problem in black and white. You might get, say, a 2.5% cost of living adjustment, your COLA, but then a huge, essential expense like your Medicare Part B premium can jump up by 6.6%. The math is simple, and it's brutal. When your biggest costs are rising almost 3 times faster than your income, you are losing ground. Every single year. It's exactly why so many people feel like they just can't catch a break.
So, the big question is, how do we fix this? Let's get into the first set of solutions. 2 major bills have been introduced in Congress that aim to provide a direct lifeline by seriously boosting Social Security payments. And we're not talking about minor tweaks here. These are substantial increases.
Okay, so the first one is called the Social Security Expansion Act. The 2 key words to focus on here are immediate and across the board. This isn't something you'd have to wait years for, and it's not something that only applies to a small group of people. The whole point is to provide universal, fast relief to fight back against inflation.
So what does that look like in real dollars? Well, the Act proposes a direct increase of $200. It's not a complicated percentage or a formula you have to figure out, just a flat, straightforward boost right in your monthly check. And let's be crystal clear about this. This is not a one-time stimulus payment. We're talking about an extra $200 every single month. And this would apply to everyone receiving Social Security benefits. That includes retirement, disability, spousal, and survivor benefits. I mean, when you compare that to a recent COLA that might have only been about 40 or 50 bucks for many people, you really see just how significant this is.
And if you zoom out and look at it over a full year, the impact is even bigger. An extra $200 a month? That adds up to $2,400 over the course of a year. For anyone on a tight budget, that kind of money isn't just helpful, it's transformational. That could be several months of prescriptions paid for. It could cover an unexpected car repair. Or it could simply mean less stress and not having to choose between paying the utility bill or buying groceries.
Okay, so that's the first big proposal. Now the second one is called the Social Security 2100 Act. While the Expansion Act is for everybody, this one is much more targeted. It's designed as a real lifeline for the people who are struggling the most, the folks who are currently getting the absolute minimum Social Security benefit.
And the increase being proposed here, it is massive. This act would provide a $660 increase. For those on the lowest rung of the Social Security ladder, an amount like this, it's not just helpful, it's absolutely life-changing. It's a direct injection of funds aimed squarely at the most financially vulnerable people.
So what's the logic behind that $660 number? Well, it has a very specific goal, to lift recipients up to 125% of the federal poverty level. See, there are many seniors out there getting a check for around $900 a month, just trying to scrape by. This permanent increase is designed to give them not just a little relief, but a real measure of financial stability and dignity. Okay, so those were the big, immediate boosts to your check. But what about fixing that underlying problem? You know, the annual raise that never seems to be enough? Well, that brings us to the second major type of proposal, creating a stronger, more reliable cost of living adjustment, or COLA.
The proposed solution is actually pretty simple. Set a new baseline. So while a recent COLA might have been 2.5%, one proposal would establish a minimum COLA of 3.5%. That word minimum is the key. It means your annual adjustment could never, ever fall below that number. It would create a protective floor, a safety net, to make sure your benefits have a much better chance of actually keeping up with real-world inflation.
Now, beyond direct cash payments, there are also some really crucial proposals on the table to help with two of the most fundamental needs we all have: food and health. These changes are designed to address some very specific frustrations and gaps in the current system.
This proposal takes on two major frustrations with the food stamp program, also known as SNAP. First up is the minimum payment. Right now, the minimum is just $23 a month, which, let's be honest, often doesn't even feel worth the paperwork. The idea is to raise that to $75, which would provide much more meaningful help. Second is the asset limit. The current limit can disqualify you for having as little as $4,500 in savings, basically penalizing you for having a small emergency fund. The proposal would more than double that limit to $10,000.
So why make these specific changes? Well, the goal is pretty straightforward: to encourage more people to get the help that they're already entitled to. The estimates are kind of shocking. About 5 million seniors are eligible for food stamps, but they don't apply. And it's often because the benefit seems too small, or they're afraid of being penalized for the modest savings they've worked their whole lives for. These proposals are designed to get rid of those barriers.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground and a lot of different numbers, so let's pull it all together right now and just summarize what this collection of proposals could tangibly mean for you and for your finances.
So let's just recap the biggest proposals on the table. We've got a potential $200 per month universal boost to Social Security, a massive $660 monthly increase for those on the minimum benefit, a guaranteed floor of 3.5% for your annual raise, and a more substantial minimum food stamp benefit of $75. Put it all together, and you see a multifaceted approach to providing real, tangible financial relief.
You know, at the end of the day, these proposals go way beyond just dollars and cents. They're about providing security and dignity and peace of mind. All of these bills are currently being debated, and they represent a potential future with a lot more financial breathing room, which really just leaves us with one final thought to consider for yourself.
Today, we're diving into a really huge idea that's being debated for the future of Social Security. We're talking about a proposal that could completely reshape the monthly checks for millions of people. And believe it or not, it all comes down to just one number: $1,304. Now, that is not some random figure pulled out of a hat. This is the heart of a major proposal for a new monthly minimum benefit for every single person on Social Security. So what would that actually mean? Who would it help? And the big one, could it even work? Come on, let's break it all down.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the problem, why this idea is even on the table. Then we'll get into the weeds of the 1304 proposal itself. We'll look at two very different ways it could work, tackle that giant funding question, and then wrap up with a reality check on where things really stand today. Okay, so let's jump right in. To really get why a number like $1,304 is such a big deal, we have to first understand the pretty stark reality that a lot of people in Social Security are facing every single day. Yeah, just look at that number, 10.8 million. That's how many people receiving Social Security benefits are living below the poverty line. And get this, that's often after you count any other income they might have. So this right here, this is the core problem that is people scrambling for a really big solution. So this federal poverty line isn't just some abstract idea. It's a hard number. For 2025, it's pegged at $15,650 a year for a single person. And if you pull out your calculator and divide that by 12 months, yep, you get $1,304 a month. That figure is the absolute rock bottom minimum the government says you need for necessities, and it's at the very center of this whole debate. And that leads us right to the proposal itself. I mean, the logic is pretty straightforward, right? If we know millions of people are living below this very specific income level, the idea being floated is simple. Why not just use Social Security to fix it directly? So the heart of the idea is to create a brand new, hard floor for benefits. It's pretty simple. No matter your work history, no matter how much you paid in, your monthly Social Security check would never be less than the poverty line. It would basically be a guarantee. Now, to see just how massive a change this would be, you gotta see what the current minimum looks like. No, that is not a typo. Believe it or not, the current special minimum benefit can be as low as $50 a month. 50. I mean, that barely gets you a full tank of gas, let alone a week's worth of groceries. It provides almost no real security, and that's the basement level we're starting from. So the idea is to go from a minimum of maybe $50 to a minimum of over $1,300. That isn't just a small tweak, that's a seismic shift. For anyone at the lowest end of the benefit scale, this would be absolutely life-altering. But, and you knew there was a but coming, this is where it all gets a little more complicated. Agreeing that $1,304 sounds good is one thing. Figuring out how to actually do it is way harder. And right now, there are two really different visions for how it could be done. Okay, so on one side, you have the minimum benefit approach. Think of it like a safety net. If your current benefit is, say, $900 a month, this plan would boost it up to $1,304. Simple. But if you're already getting $1,800, nothing changes for you. It just helps the lowest earners. Now, on the other side is the much more radical flat benefit idea. This would set everyone's benefit, no matter who you are, to exactly $1,304. So that person at $900 goes up, but the person getting $1,800, their benefit would actually get cut. And that flat benefit approach, wow, that would fundamentally transform the entire system. For its whole history, Social Security has been based on this idea. What you get out is linked to what you paid in. A flat benefit would completely sever that link. It would basically turn Social Security into a guaranteed basic income for more than 70 million Americans, where everybody gets the exact same check. And this is why that flat benefit idea is, well, so controversial. Sure, it would be a huge help to people at the very bottom, but it would mean a massive pay cut for millions of others. Right now, the average retirement benefit is just under $2,000 a month. So under a flat benefit plan, the average retiree would suddenly see their payment drop by nearly $700. Can you imagine telling people who planned their entire retirement around a certain income that it's about to be slashed? Yeah, the political opposition would be enormous, which is why most people see this version as pretty much a non-starter. So let's put that flat benefit idea aside for a second and just focus on the more popular version, just lifting up the lowest earners. Even with that more modest plan, we still slam into the biggest question of all. How in the world do you pay for it? Yeah, this is the multi-trillion-dollar question. Raising benefits for millions of people isn't free. It would cost a staggering amount of money, and right now, nobody really agrees on where that money should come from. It's almost always the hardest part of the puzzle to solve. Well, one idea that gets thrown around is to look at the Social Security Trust Fund itself. It's got about $2.7 trillion in it, but it's invested super conservatively, so it's only getting back about a 2.4% return. Some people argue that if we invested that money a little more strategically, we could generate billions more in revenue without raising taxes on anybody. But of course, a strategy like that comes with a whole new set of risks and a whole lot of heated debate. So, after all this talk about poverty lines, different visions, and where to find the money, where do things actually stand today? It's really important we do a reality check on whether any of this is actually close to happening.
And the honest-to-goodness reality is that right now, these are all just ideas. There are a ton of proposals floating around Washington, but there isn't one single piece of legislation that has broad support. A lot of observers say the concerning thing isn't just that this specific plan isn't moving forward, but that there's no unified plan for the future of Social Security at all.
So, what's the most important thing to take away from all this? Well, even if the $1,304 plan doesn't become law tomorrow, the fact that we're even having this conversation is huge. It tells us that the debate around Social Security is changing. The focus is starting to shift from seeing it as just a retirement program to seeing it as a powerful tool we could use to fight poverty head on and provide a real financial safety net. And that really leaves us with this one fundamental question. For decades, we've thought of Social Security as an earned benefit. You work, you pay in, and you get it back. But should its main purpose evolve? Should its number one job be to make sure no senior, no person with a disability has to live in poverty, no matter what they earned in the past? The answer to that question is going to define the future of Social Security for generations to come. There's a question that just keeps popping up, and I see it everywhere. Are we going to get a fourth stimulus check? It's a huge topic online, and honestly, for very good reason. So today, we're going to cut through all that noise and really look at what the economy itself is telling us. So let's just get right to it. This is the question on everybody's mind. And listen, while there's tons of speculation out there, the real answer isn't buried in some political headline. Nope. It's found in the economic data. And that's not an exaggeration. We're talking about this today because for millions of people who are really feeling the financial squeeze, this isn't just some abstract idea. It's a very real daily concern. So let's try to get some real clarity. All right, here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start with what actually triggers these payments. Then we'll look at a pretty surprising pattern from the past. After that, we'll zero in on the one economic number you need to keep an eye on. And finally, we'll talk about why the next stimulus might look totally different from the last one. Okay, first things first. What actually causes a stimulus check to happen in the first place? It's not random, and it's not just politics. It is a direct, calculated response to one specific event, an economy that's gotten sick. And when we say the economy is sick, we're really talking about a recession. That's the official word for it, right? A major, widespread, and kind of prolonged downturn that hits everything and everyone, from big corporations to your local coffee shop. And this right here is the core idea we need to understand. If you just look back at the last couple of decades, the pattern is crystal clear. Every single major recession has been followed by stimulus checks. Every single time. It's basically become a standard move in the modern economic playbook. Here's a great way to think about it. Imagine the economy is a patient. A recession? That's when the patient gets seriously ill. The lawmakers are the doctors, and their go-to prescription is a big old injection of cash. That's the stimulus, to try and get the patient back up and running. And it makes sense, right? The sicker the patient, the bigger the dose of medicine they're going to need. So let's dig into that history a little bit, because when you actually examine the numbers from past recessions, well, a really fascinating and maybe even predictive pattern starts to show up. Okay, check this out. Back in 2001, after the dot-com bubble burst, the check was for $300. Then in 2008, during that massive financial crisis, it doubled to $600. And then in 2020, with the pandemic, it doubled again to $1,200. Are you seeing the pattern here? Now, if you just follow that doubling logic, the next number in that sequence would be around $2,400. But, and I have to be super clear about this is just an observation of a historical trend. It is absolutely not a guarantee. The actual amount of any future check would depend completely on how severe the economic downturn is at the time. So if a sick economy is the trigger, how do we know when it's sick enough for the doctors to step in? Well, there's one key health report that we can all look at. It comes out on the first Friday of every single month, and it's simply called the Jobs Report. And inside this report, there are a few vital signs. You've got the headline number, the unemployment rate. But just as important is jobs created or lost. Are companies hiring, or are they laying people off? The labor participation rate tells us how many people are even trying to find a job, and average hourly earnings shows if our paychecks are keeping pace with inflation. Altogether, they paint a pretty clear picture of our economic health. So when you start to see that businesses, from the giant corporations all the way down to your local pizzeria, are slowing down their hiring, or worse, starting to let people go, that is a massive warning flare for the whole economy. It means people aren't spending as much, companies are getting nervous, and the whole economic engine is starting to sputter. That is the signal that gets lawmakers to scramble and start seriously talking about what they need to do. But, and this is really important, if they do act again, there's a good chance it won't be a carbon copy of last time. The whole strategy could shift to something much more targeted.
See, the last few checks were broad. They went out to a massive chunk of the population. A targeted strategy is different. It would focus laser-like on low-income and fixed-income households. Why? Because those are the folks most likely to spend the money immediately and pump it right back into the economy. This gives you way more bang for your buck, and it does it with less risk of driving up inflation for everybody else.
So the big takeaway here is this. We might need to adjust our expectations. If and when another stimulus package comes along, it could be designed very, very differently, maybe aimed at a smaller group of people to get the maximum economic impact with the fewest negative side effects.
Okay, so let's just trace that path one more time. It starts with an economic contraction. We see it in those bad jobs reports. That triggers the lawmakers' scramble, where they have to respond. Then a stimulus package is passed, and finally, the payments are distributed with one single goal: to get spent right away and kickstart the economy. So that brings us to the final thought. Based on modern history, it really doesn't seem to be a matter of if the government will intervene in the next major recession. The real question is, how sick does the economy have to get before they open up that playbook once again? That's what we'll all be watching.
Okay, so you've probably seen this number making the rounds online. A massive 20.3% raise for Social Security beneficiaries. I mean, it's the kind of number that sounds incredible, almost too good to be true, right? It could be absolutely life-changing for millions, but where did it even come from? Is it a real proposal? Is it some kind of back payment plan? Or is it just a big misunderstanding? Today, we are going to get to the bottom of it. We're going to decode that number and figure out what it really means.
And that brings us to the big question, the one that's on everybody's mind. Is a 20.3% raise for Social Security actually on the table for 2025? It's a really powerful idea, especially with how expensive everything has gotten for folks on a fixed income. Before we break it all down, just take a second and think, what would a raise that big mean for you? For your monthly budget, your peace of mind, your ability to just handle things? It's a powerful thought. So let's dig in and find out what's really going on here.
So let's turn that percentage into actual dollars, because that's what really matters. For the average SSI beneficiary, we're talking about an extra $200 per month. Think about that for a second. That's not just a number. That's a full tank of gas and groceries, or a utility bill paid off with less stress.
Now, for SSDI beneficiaries, that number jumps even higher to an extra $300 a month. I mean, that's a really significant boost that could help cover things like medical copays or just give you a little bit of breathing room in your budget.
And for the average retired worker, the increase would be even bigger, about $380 more every single month. If you stretch that out over a year, that's nearly $4,600. So yeah, it is no wonder a number like 20.3% got everyone's attention. It's huge.
With figures like these, you have to ask, is this for real? Is it a real possibility? Well, to find out, we have to understand where that 20.3% number actually came from in the first place.
Okay, this is the key to the whole story. That 20.3% didn't just appear out of thin air. It's actually rooted in real data from the Social Security Administration. But, and this is a big but, it's the interpretation of that data that's caused all this excitement and confusion. So let's peel back the layers and actually look at the math behind the headline.
All right, let's dive in and really deconstruct this number. In this section, we're going to trace that 20.3% right back to its source. And, spoiler alert, it is not a proposed bill for a new raise, and it's not a retroactive payment plan that's being debated in Congress. The truth is actually a lot simpler, and it has everything to do with the cost of living adjustments. You know, the COLAs that have already been paid out. So here's where it comes from. It's actually simple math. If we look at the official cost of living adjustments over the last few years, in 2022, we got a 5.9% raise. Then in 2023, that huge 8.7% increase. For 2024, it was 3.2%. And if we add a projected 2.5% for 2025, what do you get when you add all that up? You got it, exactly 20.3%. And that's the big aha moment right there. The 20.3% figure is not a new proposal for a one-time check. It is the cumulative total of the annual COLA increases from 2022 all the way through the projection for 2025. It's a way of measuring how much benefits have already gone up during a period of really high inflation. So it's not a future promise, it's more like a look in the rearview mirror. But that raises a really important question. If 20.3% is just the sum of old raises, why is everyone talking about back pay? Well, the answer is in the gap between those official COLA numbers and the reality of what things actually cost.
And this right here, this is the heart of the issue. While benefits have gone up by that 20.3% over 4 years, just look at what's happened to prices. The cost of groceries has jumped somewhere between 22 and 25% in that same time. And utilities like electricity and gas, whoa, that increase is staggering, anywhere from 28 to as high as 40%. It's plain to see the official raises just haven't kept up.
And you know, the financial pressure doesn't just stop with food and utilities. The cost of shelter, whether it's rent or a mortgage, has just skyrocketed. And medical expenses have seen a huge jump too. We're talking higher copays every time you see a doctor and rising premiums for insurance. When you put it all together, it's pretty clear that even with that 20.3% cumulative raise, the actual purchasing power of your benefit has gone down.
So, this all leads to the next logical question. If there's such a clear gap between the COLAs and the actual cost of living, why not just pass a law to give everyone a retroactive payment to make up for it? That's the whole idea behind this back pay concept. But, as good as it might sound, there are some pretty big political and financial hurdles that make a plan like that extremely unlikely to ever happen.
Let's just walk through the reality here. First, any kind of payment like this would need a brand new law passed by both the House and the Senate. That's a huge challenge right there. The president can't just sign an executive order and make it happen. Plus, and this is a really big one for lawmakers, pumping that much cash into the system would make Social Security's financial problems happen a lot sooner. And finally, it's just important to know that while there's a lot of talk, there is no actual bill in Congress for this 20.3% back pay idea. You know, even though this whole 20.3% conversation is based on a misunderstanding, it serves a really important purpose. It's shining a bright light on a much bigger, much more urgent debate. Is the current Social Security system, especially the way it calculates raises, still adequate for the financial realities that we're all facing today?
This quote really gets to the heart of why this matters so much. For most people, getting these benefits, this isn't just some extra spending money. This is their income. It's what they depend on for most, if not all, of their budget each month. That's why these discussions are so critical. We're talking about the primary financial lifeline for tens of millions of Americans.
So ultimately, that's what this all boils down to. The 20.3% figure that went viral, it isn't a real proposal, but it has become a powerful symbol. It represents the very real frustration and the financial squeeze felt by millions of people whose official cost of living adjustments are falling further and further behind their actual cost of living. It's a symptom of a much larger debate we need to have.
And this brings us to our final and maybe the most important question. This whole 20.3% debate has made one thing crystal clear. There's a major disconnect between the formula and reality. So as the cost of everything, housing, food, healthcare, keeps climbing, how can the Social Security system evolve? What changes are needed to make sure that these benefits provide not just a safety net, but a real foundation for a dignified life? That is the real conversation this viral number has forced all of us to have.
So today we're going to unpack the really complex economic signals that could trigger future government relief. What actually has to happen in the economy for stimulus to even be on the table? Let's find out. You know, the question of another stimulus check, it's on a lot of people's minds. And it's not just some abstract economic debate, right? It's driven by very real everyday financial pressures that struggle to pay the rent, buy groceries, and just cover the bills. We see these concerns everywhere. So we're going to break down the actual mechanics behind any potential government action. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle that big stimulus question head on. Then we'll look at what an economy in distress actually looks like. We'll explore a pretty innovative idea for automatic relief. We'll pinpoint why unemployment is the main trigger. And then finally, we'll give you the key signs that you can watch for yourself. Okay, so first things first. Before we dive into the how and the why, let's just set the record straight on where things actually stand right now. Let's just cut right to the chase. The single most important thing to know is this. As of this moment, no new stimulus check has been passed into law. Now, while there's a ton of conversation and speculation out there, nothing has been officially approved by lawmakers. And, you know, that leads to a really crucial point. Stimulus payments are not random acts of government generosity. They are a very specific tool. Think of it like an emergency brake that only gets pulled when the economy is in real, serious trouble. The health of the economy is the one and only prerequisite.
So what does that economic weakness even mean? What does it look like? Well, it's almost never just one bad number. It's more like a chain reaction, a whole series of dominoes just falling one after another. Let's trace that path.
And this slide right here shows that chain reaction perfectly. It all kicks off when people like you and me spend less money. That, of course, means less revenue for businesses, which forces them to cut costs. And often that means layoffs. This rising joblessness is the most visible sign of distress, and it's that final domino that really pressures lawmakers to step in.
There's this quote that just perfectly captures the speed of a downturn. Building an economy is often the slow, methodical climb up the stairs. But a recession? Oh, that's the express elevator straight down. Fear and contraction, they just spread so much faster than confidence and growth. Now, I know the word recession can sound pretty scary, right? But from a purely economic view, it's actually a natural part of the business cycle. It's not necessarily a flaw, but more of a big old reset. It can be a painful process for sure, but sometimes it's what clears out the old stuff and sets the stage for the next period of growth.
So when the economy takes that elevator ride down, how does the government actually respond? Well, the typical way is slow and very political. But let's explore a fascinating, much more streamlined idea that was proposed a few years back. Okay, so on the left, you've got the usual way things work. A crisis hits, and bam, lawmakers are scrambling. They debate, they argue, and eventually they try to pass these massive, complex bills like the CARES Act. It can be a really slow, politically charged process. But on the right is a totally different idea. What if the response was just built in? What if it was automatic?
And this is the whole idea behind what economists call automatic stabilizers. Just think of it like a pre-programmed system with a simple if-then rule. If the unemployment rate goes up and hits a specific predetermined level, then a payment is automatically triggered and sent out to people. No debate, no scramble, just an immediate response based on real-time data.
But here's the reality check. As cool and efficient as this whole if-then system sounds, it's important to remember it was only ever a proposal. The legislation was introduced, but it never actually passed into law. So our current system is still the reactive manual one, not the automatic one.
So if relief isn't triggered automatically, what is the one signal that lawmakers and economists are all watching? Let's zoom in on that main trigger.
It really boils down to one number more than any other, the unemployment rate. And why is that? Well, because it gives us the clearest, broadest snapshot of the entire economy's health. It's like the 30,000-foot view, It tells us directly how many people are out of work, which tells us how businesses are doing on a massive scale.
And that one number, it tells two completely different stories about the country. In a strong economy, low unemployment means businesses are confident, they're hiring, people feel secure enough to spend. But in a weak economy, rising unemployment signals that businesses are cutting jobs to survive, and consumers, feeling that uncertainty, start to pull back on their spending.
And here's the reason why layoffs happen so darn fast during a downturn. For the vast majority of businesses out there, their single biggest bill is payroll. It's paying their people. So when their revenues drop, like we saw in that domino effect, they have to make some really tough choices to stay afloat. And cutting headcount is often the first and most significant lever they can pull. That's the direct link between shrinking consumer spending and rising unemployment.
So let's bring it all together and build our own economic dashboard. If you want to know which way the winds are blowing for yourself, these are the key numbers you got to follow. First up, of course, is that unemployment rate we've been talking so much about. But you also want to watch weekly jobless claims. Think of this as a real-time alarm bell for new layoffs. Third, the labor force participation rate. This basically asks how many people have just given up looking for a job entirely. A falling number there is about sign. And finally, average hourly earnings. This one's simple. Are people's paychecks growing or shrinking? Together, these four numbers paint a really clear picture. So at the end of the day, the takeaway is really simple. Stimulus isn't about politics. It's not about petitions. It's all about the data. A significant, sustained weakening of the economy, confirmed by the indicators we just talked about, is the one and only catalyst that puts government relief back on the table.
Which leaves us with one final, bigger question to chew on. We've talked about these downturns as a painful part of the cycle, but are they a fundamental flaw in how our economy is designed? Or are these
big ol' resets, a necessary, albeit difficult feature that ultimately allows for new growth and opportunity to come out on the other side. That's something to ponder. So there's a lot of talk right now about a new proposal for a $600 payment, right? And, it's raising a ton of questions. So today, we're going to cut through all that noise and give you the real answers, straight from the source. Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll cover the basics of what this proposal even is. Then we'll get into the numbers, who gets paid, how much. After that, we're going to tackle some of the biggest questions people are asking, see what kind of hurdles it's facing in Congress, and then wrap it all up with what you really need to know. All right, first things first. What exactly is this American Worker Rebate Act? So the big thing everyone's talking about is this proposed payment of at least $600. And yeah, the official language calls it a rebate, but let's be real. For all intents and purposes, it's set up to work a lot like those stimulus checks we've seen before. And just so we're all on the same page, the official name is the American Worker Rebate Act of 2025. It was introduced in the Senate by Josh Hawley, who's a Republican senator from Missouri. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Where is the money actually coming from? Well, this isn't about printing more cash. The idea here is to frame it as a kind of profit share. Basically, giving Americans a direct slice of the money the government brings in from tariffs. All right, let's get to the question everyone really cares about, right? How much money are we talking about, and who would actually get it? Okay, so the proposal calls for a payment of at least $600, and that's for every single qualifying adult. And get this, it's not just for adults. That same $600 amount would also go out for each dependent, so that could add up pretty quickly for families. Now, of course, there are income limits. To get the full amount, if you're filing as an individual, you'd need to make $75,000 or less. For married couples, that number doubles to $150,000. If you make more than that, the payment starts to phase out, so you get a smaller amount. Whenever a proposal like this drops, it just naturally creates a ton of questions, and honestly, a bit of confusion. So let's take a minute and clear up some of the most common things people are asking. Okay, this is probably the biggest one we've seen. People see the word worker right there in the title and, they immediately think, oh no, I don't have a job. Does that mean I'm out? It's a totally fair question. So let's just clear this up right now. The simple answer is no. That word worker in the title, it's just part of the name. It is not an eligibility requirement. The whole point of the bill is to be inclusive, no matter what your job situation is. All right, the next big question comes from folks on fixed or low incomes. Think about retirees, people on Social Security. A lot of them don't usually file a tax return every year. So the big question is, how would they get this payment? The answer is all about how the payment is structured. See, it's set up as something called a refundable tax credit. And I know that sounds like tax jargon, but that phrase is super important for understanding why you could still get the money, even if you don't file. Okay, let me break this down. A non-refundable credit is pretty simple. It can only lower the taxes you owe. If you don't owe any taxes, you get $0. It can't go below zero. But a refundable credit, which is what this proposal is a total game changer. It means that even if your income is zero, even if you owe zero in taxes, the Treasury will still cut you a check for the full amount. It's actual cash in your pocket. Okay, now for a really important reality check. We have to remember, this is all still just a proposal, right? It's not a done deal. So what actually needs to happen for this thing to become law? Well, it's cleared the very first hurdle. The bill has been formally introduced in the Senate, which means it's an official piece of legislation now. But, and this is a big but, it still has a really long journey ahead. It's got to go through the entire legislative process before it could ever be passed and signed into law. So how could it actually pass? Well, one way is for it to be debated all on its own as a standalone bill. But what's probably more likely for something like this is that it gets attached to a bigger, must-pass piece of legislation, something like the federal budget or a big reconciliation bill. It's actually a pretty common strategy in Washington to get things like this through Congress. All right, let's pull all this together. What are the key takeaways you really need to remember about this proposal? So to recap, here's the deal. We're talking about a proposal for a $600 payment. It's a refundable credit, which is key. It's meant to cover both adults and their dependents as long as you're under the income limits. That's $75K for singles, $150K for couples. Super important. Your job status or whether you file taxes does not disqualify you. And the biggest thing to remember, it's still just a proposal. It has to pass Congress to become real. And that really leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? The proposal is officially on the table. We can see the different ways it might move forward, but as it makes its way through the maze of Washington politics, the real test is going to be whether it can get enough political momentum to actually cross the finish line. For now, it's an idea, just waiting for its moment.
You know, remember those stimulus checks we all got a few years back? For some people, they were an absolute lifeline. For others, well, they were a nice little bonus. A really fascinating new study is asking a powerful question. What if we could have gotten a much, much bigger economic boost, but for a fraction of the cost? The answer, it turns out, lies in getting the money to the right people and doing it in a totally different way. So let's break down this idea for what might just be a smarter stimulus.
Okay, so let's get right to the heart of it. The proposal this study makes is for a recurring $2,000 monthly check. But wait, this isn't some money for everyone idea. Not at all. The entire strategy really hinges on who gets this check, and the data suggests that being super precise is the key to making it all work.
So to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to walk through 4 key parts. First, we'll look back at the stimulus dilemma from 2020 and 2021. Then, we'll uncover a key economic clue that is absolutely central to this new idea. After that, we'll compare the economic impact of spenders versus savers. And finally, we'll explore all the details of this proposal for a smarter stimulus.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the stimulus dilemma. You know, to figure out where we might be going, we first have to really understand where we've been. So let's take a look back at the lessons we learned from that last big round of stimulus payments.
So between 2020 and 2021, the government pushed out 3 big waves of stimulus checks, and the total price tag? A pretty staggering $850 billion. I mean, that's more than the entire economy of some countries. The whole goal was to jumpstart our economy, but a price tag that big raises a really important question. Did that money actually get spent in the right places, or did we kind of miss the mark?
Well, here were the core problems with that old approach. The checks went out to about 85% of the population. That means a huge chunk of that money went to people who, frankly, didn't really need it for their immediate expenses. Economists have a name for this. They call it the helicopter approach, just kind of dumping money across the landscape and hoping for the best. And the result? Well, not only was it super inefficient, but some studies suggest it added about 3 percentage points to the inflation that came later. There just had to be a better way.
And that leads us right into our second section, a key economic clue. See, researchers who are analyzing all this data found a secret to making stimulus way more effective. And it all comes down to understanding one simple but really powerful economic principle. That principle is called the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. Now, don't let the name fool you. It sounds really academic, but it's an incredibly simple idea. It just measures one thing. When you get an extra dollar, how much of it do you actually spend and how much do you save? That's the whole concept right there.
Let's just boil it all the way down. Forget the jargon for a second. NPC is really just asking this one simple question. How likely are you to spend the next dollar you get? That's it. And this simple question, it turns out, is the key to unlocking a much more effective stimulus strategy.
So this concept basically creates 2 very distinct groups of people. You've got folks with a high MPC. They're typically on lower incomes, so an extra dollar is very likely to be spent immediately on necessities. Then you have people with a low MPC. They're usually on higher incomes, so that extra dollar is way more likely to be saved or invested. Simply put, the less of a financial cushion you have, the more likely you are to spend new money right away. And that distinction, well, it changes everything.
Okay, so let's move on to Section 3 and see how this all connects. Spenders versus savers. Now that we understand what MPC is, let's actually apply it. Let's follow the money and see what happens when we give the same amount of cash to people on opposite ends of that spectrum.
Let's use that core member from the study, $2,000. Now, imagine 2 of these checks are sent out. One goes to a spender, someone with a high MPC. The other one goes to a saver, someone with a low MPC. The amount of money is exactly the same, but where it goes next tells 2 completely different stories about the economy.
The data for the person with the high MPC is pretty striking. When this person gets that $2,000, the vast majority of it, about $1,600, is spent within just 10 days. The rest of it, gone within a month. This means the entire amount gets injected directly back into the economy, buying groceries, paying rent, supporting local businesses. This is stimulus in its absolute purest form.
And you know, this is the perfect time for a little reality check. The whole purpose of a stimulus check is right there in the name, to stimulate. It's not designed to be a savings plan or a debt reduction tool. Its only job is to get money moving through the economy to keep everything going. Spending isn't a side effect of the program, it's the entire point. So what happens when that same $2,000 check goes to a person with a low MPC, the saver? Well, the study found that they generally don't spend much of it at all. That money gets saved, or invested, or used to pay down a mortgage. From an economic stimulus perspective, that money is effectively taken right out of circulation. The source uses this great analogy: it's hoarded like a bunch of squirrels saving away nuts for the winter. And while saving is an amazing personal habit, it totally defeats the purpose of an economic stimulus.
So the crucial point is this. When the whole goal is to kickstart the economy, the government isn't looking for savers. It's looking for spenders. It needs people who will take that money and immediately put it right back into the system. And this is why that distinction between high and low MPC isn't just some academic theory. It's the absolute key to making a program like this work.
And this brings us to our final section, a smarter stimulus. Based on everything we've just laid out, the study proposes a completely different, much more targeted approach for the next time a major economic downturn happens. So here's the proposed model. Step 1, instead of that blanket helicopter approach, you surgically identify only the high MPC individuals. Step 2, you replace the one-off check with a sustained monthly payment. And the result is this amazing 1-2 punch. You get way more economic stimulation for every single dollar you spend, and you avoid that massive $850 billion price tag of the old method.
The benefits of this kind of model are really clear. The money goes directly to the people who need it the most and who will actually go out and spend it. This gives you a much bigger economic bang for your buck at a fraction of the total cost. And maybe the biggest shift here is moving from that one-time payment to sustained support, replacing what one person called a payment that was cool for 3 minutes with a predictable lifeline that can last for months.
So this all brings us to the final question. This model suggests we can have a stimulus that is cheaper, more effective, and much more targeted to the people who need help. It's a really powerful idea, and it's backed by a lot of data. The real question is, when the next economic crisis hits, will policymakers stick with that old helicopter approach, or will they be willing to embrace a smarter, more precise strategy? What we learned from the last crisis might just be the key to navigating the next one.
What if, instead of sending checks to almost everyone, we sent out fewer checks but made them way more powerful? We're talking about ongoing, monthly payments, but, and this is the key part, only for a very specific group of people. Let's get into it. All right, first up, let's just take a second and think back to 2020 and 2021. Remember those 3 big stimulus checks? A lot of us got them, and for some people, they were an absolute lifeline. But the big question this new report is asking is, was that really the best way to do it? Could we have gotten a bigger economic bang for our buck, with fewer negative side effects?
So the approach back then was, well, it was broad. I mean, incredibly broad. We're talking about checks going out to something like 85% of the entire US population. The idea was pretty simple, right? Just get money into as many hands as possible, as fast as possible. But as this report points out, that kind of blanket approach, it came with a massive kind of hidden cost.
And what was that cost? Well, in a word, inflation. According to this study, printing and just sending out trillions of dollars to almost everyone is a huge reason we saw that crazy inflation and all the supply chain chaos. The report uses a great analogy. It was like flooding an engine. Just too much, too fast, all at once. So if that didn't work perfectly, what's the alternative?
Okay, so to really get what this new proposal is all about, we got to wrap our heads around one core economic idea. And it's actually pretty simple. It's this: not every dollar is spent the same way. The way different people use a new dollar they get, well, that's the whole secret to making a stimulus plan actually work.
All right, so here's the fancy economic term for it: marginal propensity to consume, or MPC for short. Now I know, that sounds super complicated, but I promise it's not. It really just boils down to one simple question. If I handed you an extra dollar right now, what would you do with it? Would you spend it right away on groceries, gas, bills, or would you stick it in your savings account? That one little concept, that's the foundation for this whole new way of thinking about stimulus.
So this study kind of breaks people down into 3 main groups based on this MPC idea. First up, you've got your high MPC folks. These are generally lower income people who, look, when they get an extra buck, it's got to go right back out the door for necessities. Then you've got the medium MPC group. This is often your middle income crowd. They'll spend some of it, for sure, but they're probably going to save a good chunk of it too. And finally, you have the low MPC group. These are your high income individuals. An extra dollar for them, it's much, much more likely to get saved or invested instead of spent. So you see the pattern, right? The more money you make, the less likely you are to immediately spend the next dollar you get.
And this right here, this is really the heart of the matter. A stimulus check, it isn't supposed to be a gift.
The whole point is right there in the name, to stimulate the economy. And for that to happen, what needs to happen? The money has to be spent. It has to move. And as you can see, giving $1 to someone in that high MPC group, well, you get the most bang for your buck immediately. Over 80 cents of that dollar goes right back into the economy. That effect gets smaller and smaller with the other groups. So the bottom line is pretty clear. If you want maximum stimulus, you got to give the money to the people who are going to spend it.
Okay, so now that we've got this MPC thing down, we can look at the actual plan this report is proposing for the next time the economy takes a nosedive. And it is a radically different approach. It's laser-focused, super efficient, and, they argue, way more powerful. And the big number at the center of this whole thing? $2,000. But get this, it's not a one-time check. The proposal is for $2,000 a month, an ongoing payment designed to create real stability and a continuous flow of spending into the economy.
Now here's the crucial part. This is not for everyone. The plan is super targeted. It's aimed specifically at low-income and fixed-income folks. Think people on Social Security, disability, SSI, and VA benefits. And why them? Well, it's exactly what we just talked about. This is the high MPC group. These are the people who will take that money and, out of necessity, immediately put it back into the economy. And it's not a forever thing either. It's designed as a temporary fix, just for a few months during a really bad recession, to basically jumpstart the economic engine.
So you might be asking, okay, what's the big advantage of this laser-focused approach? Well, it's simple. You get a much bigger bang for your buck, a much bigger economic impact for a surprisingly smaller price tag. It's really about being strategic, you know, instead of just dropping cash from a helicopter and hoping for the best.
Let's just compare these two approaches side by side, because this really puts it all into perspective. The old way checks to 85% of the country, costing nearly $1 trillion. And the result, the report argues, was a ton of inflation. The new proposal, you target a much smaller group, maybe 50 to 100 million people, the ones who need it the most and will spend it the fastest. The total cost, a few $100 billion. So you get a faster, more direct boost to the economy, you help the people who are most vulnerable, and you do it all for a fraction of the cost and with way, way less risk of causing that crazy inflation.
Okay, now I have to be super clear about this next part. This is really important. As fascinating as this idea is, right now it is just that, an idea, a proposal. This is not a current government policy.
In fact, the report itself says it directly, and I'm quoting here, a $2,000 check has not been approved right now. So I just want to make sure everyone understands, this is a research paper, it's not an active program you can sign up for.
So what's the point of all this then? Well, the real value here isn't about a check that's coming in the mail tomorrow. The value is that this is a potential blueprint for the future. It's a detailed, data-driven game plan that policymakers can look at the next time we hit a big economic crisis. It's really all about learning from what happened last time so we can have a smarter, better, and less damaging response in the future.
And that really leaves us with one big final question to think about. Instead of these huge, broad, one-size-fits-all solutions, could this be the future? Is this kind of smart, targeted, data-driven support the new way we handle economic recovery? This report, for one, makes a really compelling case that it just might be.
So you've probably seen the headlines floating around about a $2,200 bonus check from Social Security. And you're likely wondering, is this for real? Am I going to get one? Well, today we're going to cut through all the noise and separate the fact from the fiction. Because believe it or not, behind this one very confusing term is a huge high-stakes debate over the entire future of Social Security. Okay, so this is the big question, right? It's the one at the heart of all the buzz. So let's just get straight to the answer. And the short answer is no. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but there is no extra payment on its way. The term $2,200 bonus check isn't about getting more money in your pocket tomorrow. Nope, it's actually a catchy and kind of misleading label for a really controversial idea that could completely change Social Security as we know it. To really understand this whole myth, we have to dig into where that $2,200 number even came from. I mean, it wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It actually represents what some researchers are calling a critical line in the sand. Here's the basic idea. The term bonus check is a label that researchers have slapped on Social Security payments that go to higher income folks. The argument is that for these people who often have other sources of income, that monthly check isn't a lifeline they need for rent or food. It acts more like, well, a supplementary bonus. And this is the magic number they came up with, $2,200 a month. What the researchers found was that, for the most part,
Beneficiaries getting less than this amount rely on it for their basic essentials. But people getting more than this are way more likely to see it as extra, supplemental income. And this one number, this single dividing line, became the turning point for a massive policy debate.
So this really creates what you could call a tale of two different benefits. For one group of people, that monthly payment is an absolute lifeline. For another group, it's viewed as something closer to a bonus. Let's really look at what the research says about the difference here.
So on one side, you have the lifeline group. Their check covers the absolute basics. We're talking rent, groceries, medical bills. Then, on the other side, you've got the bonus group. These folks often have other financial streams coming in, pensions, 401ks, investments, maybe even a part-time job. For them, the Social Security check is definitely nice to have, but it's not what's keeping the lights on. And this fundamental difference in need is the entire foundation for this whole reform proposal.
You see, it really just boils down to perception and necessity. The bigger the benefit check gets, the more it starts to feel like a bonus instead of a monthly stipend you absolutely need to survive. This psychological shift is the key that unlocks the logic behind this entire, pretty radical reform idea. Okay, so using this lifeline versus bonus idea, a very specific plan has been floated to basically rebalance the entire system. So let's break down exactly how it would work. The plan really has three main parts. First, you'd gradually reduce the benefits for the top-tier earners. Second, and this is a really big deal, you'd limit or maybe even get rid of their annual cost of living adjustment, what we call the COLA. And finally, you'd take all the money you save from those two changes and you'd redirect it, reallocate it, to boost the benefits for lower-income folks.
And that COLA is so important to this whole plan. The cost of living adjustment is that yearly raise that beneficiaries get to make sure their checks can keep up with inflation. If the price of gas and groceries goes up, the COLA is supposed to make sure your benefits buying power doesn't go down. So limiting access to this is a really powerful tool because it means that over time, the real value of those higher-end benefits would actually shrink. So what's the ultimate goal of this whole rebalancing act? What's the end game? Well, we are not talking about a small adjustment here. This is a long-term vision with a very specific and honestly pretty radical final goal. It's a vision that would play out over decades and would have some profound consequences for what Social Security even is.
The endgame has a name: equilibrium. So imagine two lines, one high and one low, that are moving further and further apart. The goal of this plan is to reverse that. You'd slowly lower the ceiling for the top earners while at the same time raising the floor for the lowest earners until eventually they meet somewhere in the middle. And look, this wouldn't just happen overnight. The sources that discuss this proposal lay out a timeline of about 20 years. It would start off slow in year one, just beginning to phase in those limits on the high-end benefits and their COLAs. By about year 5, enough money would have been saved to start boosting the lowest monthly payments. A decade in, you'd start to see a real, measurable shift in how the benefits are distributed. And the ultimate goal is to hit that equilibrium point around the 20-year mark.
But a plan this transformative was bound to get some major criticism. And the main critique isn't really about the math or the numbers. It's about philosophy. Critics argue this plan doesn't just tweak Social Security, it fundamentally rewrites its entire purpose.
This gets to what you could call the program's identity crisis. Historically, Social Security has always been seen as an earned benefit. It's kind of like an insurance program where the payout you get is tied to what you paid in over your working life. This new proposal, it shifts the focus away from earnings and puts it on to need. And in doing that, it transforms the program into something that looks a whole lot more like a guaranteed basic income, where the goal is just to give a standard amount to everybody.
So the crucial point is that this whole debate over bonus checks and equilibrium, it really forces us to face a core question about the program's identity. This isn't just a technical argument about policy. It's a deep philosophical one about what we believe Social Security should be in the 21st century. And this quote just crystallizes the fundamental conflict here. Critics say this isn't a small tweak. It's a total change of focus. It would turn a program that was designed to reflect a person's career into a poverty prevention tool. In other words, a guaranteed basic income, which is just flat out not how Social Security was ever designed to work in the first place.
And that leaves us all with a really essential question: what should the soul of Social Security be? Is it a reward for a lifetime of work and contributions, or is it a universal safety net designed to prevent poverty for everyone? There is no easy answer here, but that is the real complicated debate hiding behind the simple myth of the $2,200 bonus check.
There's all this talk about monthly raises and new checks, so we're going to break down what's really being discussed. You've probably seen these two big numbers floating around everywhere. But honestly, there is a lot of confusion. Are they real? Are they connected? Is it one or the other? Let's clear the air and figure out exactly what these are and, more importantly, where they actually stand. Okay, so our goal here is to cut through the noise and separate what's just speculation from the actual reality. We're going to look at each of these ideas one by one, where it came from, what its purpose is, and of course, what's its current status.
First up, let's talk about that proposal for a permanent monthly increase to Social Security benefits. And I want to stress that this isn't a one-time payment, but a recurring every single month addition to your check.
The magic number being tossed around here is $200. The idea is for this to be an ongoing adjustment to help folks deal with rising costs, and it would be totally separate from the usual cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, that we already have.
Now, this isn't just some idea pulled out of thin air. It's actually a key part of a real piece of legislation that has been introduced in Congress. It's called the Social Security Expansion Act.
But, and this is a really big but, here's the reality check. While the bill is out there, it has not been passed by Congress. It hasn't been signed into law. It is still very, very much just a proposal with a long road ahead before it could ever become a reality.
So why hasn't it passed? Well, it seems there's a pretty big hurdle holding this whole thing back. Even though the idea of more money sounds great to a lot of people, the way the proposal is structured right now is creating a bit of a political challenge. Let's take a look at what that is.
And here's the crux of the problem. Targeting. See, the bill as it's written now gives this raise to pretty much everybody. And the critics are saying, hang on, do higher income recipients really need this extra cash? The suggestion floating around is to refine it, to focus that raise specifically on lower income beneficiaries, to make it a tool to lift people above the federal poverty line. That, they argue, would be a much more compelling pitch, and maybe an easier sell to lawmakers.
All right, let's shift gears and talk about the other big number you've probably heard about. And it's important to know, this is a totally different beast. We are not talking about a permanent benefit increase here. This is an economic intervention.
Yep. This one is all about a one-time payment of $2,000. So think of it less like a raise and more like a single shot of cash, a one-and-done deal.
And that is a really key distinction to make. See, a stimulus check has basically nothing to do with the Social Security system itself. It's a broad economic tool the government pulls out of its toolbox when the whole economy is in trouble, think recession or high unemployment, to try and get people to start spending again.
So just like that $200 raise, let's be super clear on this one too. No new stimulus check has been approved. Right now, it is completely hypothetical. It's an idea that would only even get on the table if the economy really started to take a significant downturn.
So let's just imagine for a second that a stimulus check did get approved. Who would get it? Well, we can look at past stimulus rounds for some pretty good clues. The biggest hurdle, as always, would likely be income. Your income would need to be below a certain threshold to qualify, on top of other requirements like having a Social Security number and not being claimed as a dependent on someone else's taxes.
Okay, this next part is where things seem to get really confusing for a lot of people. It's the big question. Are we talking about one or the other? If, by some wild turn of events, both of these things were to pass, would you have to choose between them? Let's clear this up right now.
In other words, are these two ideas mutually exclusive? Let's say the stars align, the Social Security Expansion Act passes, and the economy gets bad enough for a stimulus. Could a person theoretically get both the permanent raise and the one-time check? Let's break down just how different they really are.
I mean, just look at this breakdown. They are fundamentally different concepts. The raise is a permanent change to your Social Security benefits. The trigger for it is a new law passing. The stimulus check, that's a one-time payment to jolt the economy. And the trigger for that is bad economic data. And look at where the money comes from. One is from the Social Security program, the other from general treasury funds. Two totally separate buckets of money.
So the simple answer is yes. You could, in theory, receive both. They're totally separate proposals that don't conflict with each other at all. They have different goals, different triggers, and they come from different pots of money. Getting one wouldn't automatically disqualify you from the other as long as you met the specific eligibility rules for each one.
Okay, so we've broken down both of these big ideas that are getting so much attention. So what's the bottom line? What's the reality on the ground as of today?
And folks, if you take away only one single thing from this entire explainer, please let it be this. As of right now, neither the $200 raise nor a new stimulus check has been approved. Despite all the headlines, all the videos, all the discussion, both of these ideas are still just that, ideas and proposals. They are not a reality. So if you want to keep an eye on these things yourself, here's what to watch for. For that $200 raise, you need to track the progress of the Social Security Expansion Act in Congress. Is it moving through committees? Is it being debated? For a potential stimulus check, you'll need to watch the major economic reports, things like inflation, unemployment, and GDP. That's the kind of data that would even start that conversation in the first place.
And all of this leaves us with one final, maybe bigger thought to chew on. The fact that we're even having these conversations so often, the fact that these ideas get so much attention online, what does that tell us? It suggests there's a real deep-seated issue with financial security and the struggle that so many people face with rising costs. And that's a conversation worth paying attention to, regardless of what happens with these specific proposals.
We're going to tackle a huge question that I know is on a lot of people's minds. Is a fourth stimulus check coming in 2025? We're going to cut right through all the noise and really explain what's myth, what's reality, and what economic triggers would actually have to be pulled for another payment to even be a possibility.
Okay, let's just get right to it. The big one, that $2,000 fourth stimulus check. This question comes up all the time, and it's not just from folks on fixed incomes like Social Security or VA benefits. The financial squeeze is being felt everywhere. I mean, we're seeing data that shows even people earning six figures are struggling like never before. It really has everyone asking the exact same thing. Could this be the year? So what really makes these payments happen? There's this common idea that it's all about public pressure, that if enough of us call or email or sign petitions, lawmakers will act. But the reality? Well, the reality is that how often we ask has almost nothing to do with the decision. Yeah, the decision isn't based on requests or petitions at all. It is 100% an economic one. Think of a stimulus check as a very specific tool in a toolbox, and it only gets used in one situation: a really severe economic crisis.
In fact, the official name kind of gives the whole game away. It's not really a stimulus check, it's an economic impact payment, or EIP. The name tells you its true purpose. The goal isn't just to help people out, it's to have people immediately spend that money to jolt the economy. Seriously, saving it or paying off debt actually works against what they're trying to do. The government needs to see this massive, immediate surge in spending to pull the whole economy out of a nosedive.
And the condition that triggers this kind of action is a major economic contraction, which we all know as a recession. Now, that word sounds terrifying, and honestly for good reason. But here's another way to look at it. A recession is like hitting an economic reset button. Kind of like when you're playing a video game and you just start over. A recession, as painful as it is, can be the very thing that forces those inflated prices and super high interest rates to finally come back down to earth. A short, sharp recession could be the nasty medicine the economy needs to get better.
Okay, so that's the theory. But let's talk about the real world. Where is our economy right now? To figure out if a stimulus payment is on the horizon, we have to know if the stage is even being set for that kind of big downturn.
Officially, you're always going to hear the same message. The economy is strong, keep spending, everything's fine. And there's a good reason for this. Imagine if they came out and said, yeah, we're worried. What would happen? We'd all stop spending immediately. And that would cause the very crash they're trying to avoid. So they have to maintain this illusion of strength just to keep the whole machine running.
But if you look behind that public-facing story, the actual economic data has been telling a very, very different tale for a while now. A lot of the key indicators have been flashing warning signs. You can think of them as red lights on your car's dashboard or alarm bells going off in the engine room. These signals are suggesting the economy is nowhere near as solid as the official story would have us believe.
So to understand what could happen next, a lot of investors use this really simple analogy. They say the economy takes the stairs up. Growth is this slow, grinding, step-by-step process. It takes a really, really long time to climb all the way to the top.
But here's the thing. It can't climb forever. Once it finally reaches its peak, it just kind of bounces around up there, unable to go any higher. And at that point, well, there's only one direction left to go, and that's down.
And when the economy falls, it does not take the stairs, it takes the elevator straight down. It happens fast, it's sudden, and it comes with incredible force. I mean, just think back to early 2020. In January, life was pretty normal. By February, things started to feel a little weird. And by March, the entire world had shut down. That's the elevator down.
This is exactly where many analysts believe we are right now. We're perched at the very top after that long, slow climb, just teetering on the edge of the cliff. Any little unexpected nudge could be the thing that triggers that elevator ride all the way to the bottom.
So if you're waiting for news on a stimulus check, don't watch for a press conference. You gotta watch for the real triggers. Look for consistently bad economic reports, one after another. Watch for the Federal Reserve to do something sudden, like an emergency interest rate cut. Pay attention to how people around you are spending their money. And always, always be on the lookout for a catalyst, some unexpected event, or for lawmakers to start getting serious about massive federal spending cuts. Those are the real signs.
So, you see, asking for a simple yes or no on another stimulus check is kind of asking the wrong question. The real question is about the health of the economy. It's not a matter of if lawmakers want to send out money, it's a matter of when the economy gets so bad that it forces their hand. A stimulus only happens when they have literally no other choice but to hit that big red EIP button to stop a total collapse. And now you know exactly what to look for.
And that really leaves us with this one final thought. If the economy is really teetering on that cliff edge right now, are we all just waiting for one final unforeseen nudge to send the whole thing over? We aren't just waiting on politicians to make up their minds. We might be waiting for the economy itself to take that final decisive step off the edge. And that's the real story to watch.
Okay, let's talk about a pretty wild idea. What if every single person on Social Security got the exact same check every month? I mean, not based on how much you earned during your career, but just one flat amount for everyone. It's a really radical proposal, and it's starting to get some serious attention because it would completely transform one of the country's most important programs. So let's dive in and really unpack what this is all about.
You know, right now, the system is the complete opposite of flat. It's all over the place. You've got some folks on one end getting as little as, say, $50 or $60 a month, and then on the other extreme, the maximum possible benefit is over $5,000. That is a gigantic gap, and it's really the core issue that's fueling this whole conversation.
So, before we can really get the logic behind this flat benefit idea, we've got to first understand this huge divide in the current system. It's kind of like a tale of two different programs.
And look, this isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This disparity has very real, very human consequences. Right now, there are about 11 million seniors in the U.S. living below the federal poverty line, and a lot of them depend on Social Security. That one number alone just shows you how high the stakes are here.
Yeah, that maximum benefit, the one around $5,000, it gets a lot of attention. But the reality for most people, it's nowhere close to that. The average retirement benefit is actually just under $2,000. And if you're on disability, SSDI, the average is even lower, just a bit under $1,600. So this chart really shows you the vast majority of people are a long, long way from that top payment.
This quote from one of the sources we looked at just hits the nail on the head. It talks about this massive bifurcation, and that's exactly what it is, a system split in two, where some people are getting just a few dollars, while others are getting thousands. This is the problem the flat benefit idea is trying to solve.
So what's the big idea to fix this divide? Well, it's to completely flatten the whole system, to create one single universal benefit amount that every single qualified person would get every single month.
And the number that's being talked about is around $2,200 a month. Now, that number wasn't just picked out of a hat. It's what they've calculated as the equilibrium point, the spot where the high-end and low-end benefits would eventually meet in the middle.
So how would we even get there? I mean, you can't just flip a switch overnight. The whole idea is that it would be a gradual process. You'd be systematically raising the payments for people at the bottom, while at the same time, you're slowly lowering the payments for people at the very top until everybody eventually lands on that same flat number.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a massive, complicated undertaking. So how would a change this huge actually work in practice? Let's get into the mechanics.
It really breaks down into about 4 main steps. First, you start to phase down those high-end benefits over several years. A really key part of this is step 2. You'd stop giving the annual cost of living adjustments, the COLAs, to the highest earners. Step 3, all the money you save from that gets rerouted. And finally, step 4, you use those funds to boost up all the low-end benefits until they hit that target equilibrium point.
Now, a really big piece of this whole debate is the timeline. How long would this take? Is it a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, maybe even 15 years or more? The source material shows there are different schools of thought on this. And it matters because the longer the timeline, the higher that final flat benefit is likely to be, just because of inflation and economic growth over time.
And there are a couple of different ways to actually bring those high-end benefits down. One idea is a simple annual deduction. You just trim their benefit by, say, 5% each year. The other, maybe a slightly gentler way to do it, is to just freeze their benefits by taking away their yearly COLA. That means their payment just wouldn't keep up with inflation anymore, and its real value would slowly decrease.
You know, if a plan like this actually happened, it would be so much more than just a tweak to payment amounts. It would fundamentally change the entire purpose and identity of Social Security as we know it.
What this would do is basically turn Social Security into something that looks a lot like a guaranteed basic income, or GBI. And the idea behind a GBI is pretty simple. Everyone who qualifies gets the same recurring payment. It creates a true financial floor that no one can fall beneath.
And this really gets to the philosophical heart of the whole thing. It would shift Social Security from being an earned benefit, where what you get out is tied to what you put in, to a system of universal support, where you get the benefits simply because you're a qualified citizen or resident. It's a huge change in thinking.
The potential results here are pretty massive. I mean, on the one hand, a move like this could lift millions of seniors and people with disabilities out of poverty. It would give them a stable, predictable income. It would also make the super complex Social Security formulas way, way simpler. But maybe most importantly, it forces us all to have a conversation about what we want Social Security to be in the 21st century. Let's just boil it all down and put these two systems side by side. Right now, your benefit is based on your earnings history. In the new proposal, it's based on just being a citizen or resident. The benefit amount goes from totally variable to completely flat, and the main goal of the program itself actually shifts from replacing your income to preventing poverty, period. So when you get right down to it, this whole debate makes us ask a really fundamental question about one of our most important institutions. Should Social Security be an earned benefit that you're entitled to based on your work, or should it be a guaranteed safety net for absolutely everyone? How we answer that question will really define its future.
So are we getting another stimulus check? Come on, it's the question that's on everybody's mind, right? Especially if you're on a fixed income. But what if I told you the answer isn't buried in politics? It's actually hidden in plain sight, in the economic data. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and find the one key trigger that actually makes these checks a reality.
This is the big one. It's the question we're all asking. After everything we've been through, it just feels like everyone is wondering when, or even if, more help is ever going to be on the way. Well, instead of just guessing, we're going to look at the exact same signals the people in charge are watching. It's time to see what might really be coming over the horizon.
Okay, so before we can look ahead, we have to get one really important thing straight. And, it might not be what you want to hear, but believe me, understanding this is the absolute most critical piece of the entire puzzle.
And here it is. The bottom line is, it doesn't matter how many petitions get signed or how loudly people demand more help, none of that directly triggers a stimulus check. The one thing, the only thing that acts as the catalyst is the health of the U.S. economy. Period.
Now look, I know that might sound a little discouraging at first, but it's actually the complete opposite. It's empowering. It means we can stop getting caught up in all the political noise and start looking at the real data, the same stuff the policymakers are looking at. It changes everything from just, hoping for help to actually understanding the conditions that make that help necessary.
So, if it's all about the economy, what are those conditions? What should we be looking for? Well, this brings us right to the heart of what we're talking about today, the economic trigger. Let's break down exactly how this thing works.
The key idea here is something called an inverse correlation. Now, don't let the fancy term fool you. It's actually super simple. Just think of a seesaw, right? When one side goes up, the other side has to go down. It's the same here. When the health of the economy goes down, the chances of the government sending out stimulus checks goes up. They move in opposite directions. Simple as that.
Think about it. When the economy is just humming along, jobs are everywhere, businesses are growing, there's basically zero chance of stimulus. And why would there be? You don't need to stimulate an economy that's already running hot. But when things start to slow down, when the economy looks like it's heading for a recession, that's when the whole conversation in Washington completely changes.
So what exactly should you be watching for? Well, here are the big 4 signals. First, rising unemployment claims. That's a big one. When more people are losing their jobs, it's a clear sign of trouble. Then you've got slowing growth and contracting business activity, which just means companies are making less and selling less. But honestly, the real flashing red light to watch for is the Federal Reserve. When they start cutting interest rates, you need to pay attention. They only do that when they see big trouble on the horizon and want to make it cheaper to borrow money to get things going again. These are the headlines that truly matter.
And look, this isn't just some theory somebody came up with. The data shows a crystal clear, repeating pattern throughout recent American history. It's kind of undeniable once you see it.
Let that sink in for a second. Every single major recession in the modern era has led to stimulus checks. That tells us that these payments aren't random acts of kindness. They're a standard, almost predictable response to a specific crisis, a major economic downturn. The playbook is there, and they've used it again and again. Let's just walk through it. Back in 2001, the dot-com bubble burst, and we had a recession. The response? $300 checks. Okay. 7 years later, 2008, the housing market completely collapses, triggering a massive global crisis. The response? $600 checks. Then, of course, 2020, the pandemic shuts down the entire world. The response? $1,200 checks. Are you seeing the pattern here? A major recession hits, and boom, payments go out. It has happened every single time.
But hold on, because if we look just a little bit closer at those numbers, something even more interesting and kind of wild starts to pop out. It's not just that they sent checks, it's the amount of money that tells a whole other story. Okay, so the first time, in 2001, the baseline was set, $300.
Then in 2008, when the next big crisis hit, what happened? The amount exactly doubled to $600.
And in 2020, you already know where this is going, it doubled again to $1,200. I mean, come on, that's not a coincidence. That is a clear mathematical pattern playing out over 2 decades. Each payment was literally double the one that came before it.
All right, so now we're armed with the 2 biggest clues. We know about the economic trigger, and we've seen this incredible historical pattern. So what can we reasonably guess about what might be coming next?
This is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If we were to face another major recession in the near future, would the people in charge stick to this exact same doubling pattern that's held true for more than 20 years?
Well, if you just follow the math to its next logical step, you double $1,200 and you get $2,400. Now, let's be crystal clear about this. This is not a prediction. It's just pointing out a very curious historical trend. But it is a fascinating pattern to think about, isn't it? All of this really leads to one powerful, simple takeaway. If you want to have a real idea of what's coming, you can pretty much ignore the political shouting matches. The real answers are in the jobs reports, the GDP numbers, and what the Federal Reserve is doing. You now know exactly what to look for, the real signs that history shows us come right before these payments.
And here's one final crucial warning. When these things happen, they happen fast. I mean, think back to early 2020. In February, everything seemed pretty normal. By March, the entire world had changed. And by April, checks were already on their way. The shift from a stable economy to a crisis can happen in just a few weeks. When the dominoes start to fall, they fall quickly.
So, when you put it all together, history seems to show us that a major stimulus payment isn't really a question of if, but a question of when a recession forces the government's hand. The focus shifts away from waiting for politicians to make an announcement and toward watching the economy itself. So the real question I have for you is, now that you know what to look for, what economic signs will you be watching?
So, have you heard the talk about a possible $1,400 check? And not just for anyone. This one would be aimed specifically at Social Security beneficiaries. Well, this isn't just some rumor floating around. It's actually a formal proposal that's starting to get some real attention. We're going to break down exactly what it is, who's behind it, and what it could all mean. Right, so what's the big idea here? It's pretty straightforward, but also pretty powerful. A one-time payment sent directly to people on Social Security. This is not like those broad stimulus checks that went out to almost everybody. No, this is a very targeted measure, and it's being pushed by a major advocacy group to solve a very specific problem that millions of Americans on fixed incomes are dealing with right now. Let's really dig into the details. Okay, at its core, this whole thing is a call for what they're calling a $1,400 catch-up payment. So who came up with this, and what exactly does catch-up even mean in this context? Well, the group that's really championing this is the Senior Citizens League, and they're a pretty big deal, a major advocacy group that represents older Americans. Now that's important because it tells you this isn't just a random idea. It's part of a serious, formal push to get the attention of lawmakers. They're basically arguing that something has to be done to help beneficiaries who they say have fallen way behind financially. And the number they've landed on is very specific. A single, one-time payment of $1,400. This isn't some tiny tweak to your monthly benefit. It's designed to be a pretty substantial chunk of cash, totally separate from the regular monthly payments or any of those annual cost of living increases. So why are they calling it a catch-up payment? Well, it's because the whole idea is retroactive. See, it's not about stimulating the economy going forward. It's about looking back and trying to compensate people for the buying power they've already lost over the last couple of years. It's a period where advocates argue that the annual benefit increases just did not in any way match the real-world explosion in prices for everything. But to really get why they're asking for this, you have to understand the problem they're trying to fix. And the whole argument really comes down to something we can call the COLA gap. Okay, so the central point here is that there's a huge disconnect. The official cost of living adjustment, the COLA, that's the whole system that's supposed to make sure benefits keep up with inflation. But the source material we're looking at claims these adjustments have been, frankly, lackluster and even pathetic, totally failing to show how much more expensive life has actually gotten for folks on a fixed income. And you can really see what they're talking about right here. That bar on the left, that's the official COLA increases. But then you look at the bar on the right, which shows how much the actual cost of living has reportedly jumped. That massive difference between the two, well, that's the gap. That represents a real, tangible loss of spending power for beneficiaries, month in and month out. And just when you think it can't get more complicated, there's another layer to this that makes that gap even wider. See, any COLA increase that beneficiaries get, that's not what they actually get to keep. A big slice of it is often immediately eaten up by rising Medicare Part B premiums, which, as you know, get deducted right from their checks. The source points out that just back in 2022, those premiums shot up by 14.5%. That just wipes out a huge chunk of any raise before it even has a chance to hit a bank account. This quote from the source material, man, it just says it all, doesn't it? It really captures that feeling of frustration and pressure behind this whole proposal. It's a blunt, honest take on the financial squeeze so many beneficiaries feel. The feeling is that they're stuck between COLAs that don't keep up and mandatory costs that keep going up, and it leaves them feeling like they're just constantly losing ground. So you might be wondering, has anything like this ever been done before? Is there any history of the government sending out a special payment just to Social Security recipients? Well, as it turns out, the source material points to a pretty clear example that suggests this idea isn't coming completely out of left field. Yeah, you just have to go back to 2009. Right in the aftermath of a major recession, the government did exactly that. They send out a one-time $250 payment directly and only to Social Security beneficiaries as a form of economic help. And so the people pushing for this $1,400 proposal today see that as a clear precedent. It proves that the system is in place to deliver targeted financial support to this specific group, completely outside of the normal COLA process. Okay, so even if lawmakers were to agree that, yes, this payment is a good idea, one absolutely massive question hangs over this whole thing. Where would the money come from? And this isn't just a minor detail. It's probably the biggest hurdle this proposal faces. It really comes down to two potential paths, and they could not have more different outcomes. The first path, which the Senior Citizens League's proposal seems to suggest, would be to just take the money from the Social Security Trust Fund itself. The source material raises a huge red flag on this, arguing it would just drain the fund and make it run out of money even faster. The second path, and the one the source much prefers, is to fund it from the Treasury's general fund, the same pot of money they used for the stimulus checks. Yeah, by treating this payment like economic relief from the Treasury, the money would have, and I'm quoting here, no impact on Social Security whatsoever. None. Nada. Zero. This approach would treat it as general government spending, and that would protect the long-term financial health of the Social Security program, which, let's be honest, is already facing its own serious financial challenges down the road. All right, that was a lot to take in. We've gone through the proposal itself, the problem it's trying to solve, the history behind this kind of thing, and that really critical debate over the funding. So let's kind of bring it all together and sum up what you should really take away from all this. First, and this is super important, remember this is a proposal from an advocacy group. It is not a bill that's about to become law tomorrow. Second, it's a direct answer to the very real problem of inflation just eating away at fixed incomes. Third, the biggest sticking point, the biggest debate, is how to pay for it without hurting the Social Security program. And finally, this whole thing really shines a bright light on a much bigger, ongoing conversation about how we, as a country, can best support our seniors and people with disabilities, especially when times get tough economically. And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. Looking beyond this specific $1,400 proposal, are we maybe seeing the start of a new kind of policy tool? Instead of these huge, broad stimulus payments for everybody, could these kinds of targeted, one-time payments to specific vulnerable groups become a more common way to provide economic relief in the future? It's definitely a question we're thinking about. Today, we're going to put on our detective hats and dig into the past to understand the future. We're going to look at the stories of past stimulus programs, what worked, what really didn't, and see what clues they give us about what might be coming down the pike. All right, let's just cut to the chase. This is the question on everybody's mind, right? Especially with the economy feeling a little shaky.
So, will we get another stimulus check? It sounds like a simple question, but believe me, the answer is anything but. And the key to answering that question isn't some crystal ball. Nope. It's actually found by looking back at how we've handled economic crises before. By really getting a handle on the lessons we've learned, we can actually build a pretty clear picture of what could happen next. To do that, we're going to zero in on two huge recent events: the 2008 financial crisis and, of course, the 2020 pandemic. The government's playbook for each one was completely different, and digging into why is where things get really, really interesting. So let's start with what a lot of economists call the gold standard of modern stimulus, the CARES Act from March 2020. I mean, this wasn't just another government check. It was a massive, lightning-fast response at a moment when the entire economy was in an absolute freefall. So, what made this $2.2 trillion plan work so well? Well, it really came down to three key things. First, the timing. Help got out the door just weeks after everything shut down. That's incredible speed. Second, the targeting. The money was aimed right at low and middle income families, the people who were going to go out and spend it immediately. And the third piece, the real secret weapon, technology. The IRS used direct deposit information they already had, which meant they could push money into millions of bank accounts in days, not months. It was just a masterclass in getting things done. And the results of all that? Just look at this number, 11.7 million. That is how many people the stimulus and other aid pulled out of poverty that year. It's staggering. Consumer spending, which had completely fallen off a cliff, just came roaring back. And remember, the CARES Act wasn't just about the checks. It was a full-on attack on the crisis, with loans for businesses, aid for hospitals, the whole shebang. Okay, now let's rewind the clock a bit and compare that to the 2008 financial crisis. The government's first shot at a fix, the Economic Stimulus Act of 2008, actually looked pretty good on paper. It was a solid plan for tax rebates. So just like the CARES Act, it was quick, it was targeted, and it did give spending a little boost. So why do we call it a near miss? Well, the big fatal flaw was scale. The 2008 plan was only about $100 billion. Honestly, that's like trying to fight a raging forest fire with a garden hose. Now compare that to the 2.2 times trillion dollars CARES Act. That was like calling in the entire fleet of firefighting planes. The 2008 plan was too small and too narrow, and the economy just kept sinking, which meant they had to come back with much bigger, more drastic measures later on. So, here's the big takeaway from all that. A stimulus has to be big enough to match the crisis. It's a really powerful lesson, and one we learned the hard way. Yeah, timing and targeting are absolutely crucial to get the money to the right people at the right time, but if you don't send enough of it, you're just not going to turn the tide. Now, history is also packed with examples of what not to do, and there are three traps that stimulus plans fall into over and over again. First up, delay. It's a killer. If the money shows up months after people's finances have been wrecked, it's not preventing a crisis, it's just cleaning up a mess. Then there's poor targeting. This is a classic. Sending checks to wealthy folks who are just going to stick it in a savings account doesn't help the economy much. You want the money in the hands of spenders. And finally, complexity. If you make a program so complicated with so much red tape that people can't even figure out how to get the help, well, then the aid never actually gets to where it needs to go. Okay, so we've got a pretty clear historical playbook on what to do and what to avoid. So the big question is, do any of today's economic signs suggest we might need to pull that playbook off the shelf? Let's take a look at the dashboard right now. When we look at the key indicators, we're not seeing any giant red flashing alarm bells. Not yet anyway. But what we are seeing is a lot of flashing yellow lights. Unemployment is starting to slowly tick up. The economy's growth is slowing down. Consumer confidence has been dropping as people get more worried about their budgets. And the housing market, which is often a sign of things to come, is definitely cooling off. Now, no single one of these is a full-blown crisis, but when you put them all together, they start to paint a picture of an economy that's losing steam. Because of all these mixed signals, a lot of economists are looking for a clear, objective trigger for action. And one idea that's really gaining steam is something called the SOM rule. You can think of it like an economic tripwire. Basically, if the unemployment rate rises just 0.5 percentage point over its recent low, ding, 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 the alarm goes off. It's a simple, data-driven way to say, okay, a real downturn is starting, and it takes all the political guesswork out of the decision. So we have the lessons from 2008 and 2020, and we have the warning signs from today's economy. So what happens if we put those two things together? Well, if those yellow lights do turn red, history actually gives us a surprisingly detailed blueprint for what might happen next.
If history is any guide, a future stimulus package would probably be built on these pillars. First, it would likely be triggered by a clear signal, like the SOM rule, to make sure it's timely. The payments would be targeted straight to lower and middle-income households to get the biggest bang for the buck. It would also be multifaceted, a lot like the CARES Act, with a mix of direct checks, unemployment aid, and business support. And finally, it would have to be substantial. Based on what we saw in 2020, to really make a difference, we'd probably be looking at payments somewhere in that $1,200 to $1,400 range.
Now, for the million-dollar question, when? Obviously, nobody knows for sure, but based on the current data and how things are trending, this is a plausible, though I have to stress, hypothetical timeline. If the economy continues to slow down through 2025, you could see serious talk about a stimulus start to heat up toward the end of that year. That could open a window for actual legislation in early 2026. Again, this is just a forecast based on the trends. It is definitely not a prediction.
At the end of the day, they say history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. The lessons from the past have given us a pretty clear map. We know what success looks like. You go fast, you go targeted, and you go big. And we know the dangers of doing too little, too late. As we look at the economy today, the goal isn't to be worried or overconfident, it's just to be aware. History has shown us that when things get bad enough, stimulus goes from a maybe to a probably. So the final question is this. We have the map. Are we about to start down a very familiar road?
You know, whenever stimulus checks come up, the conversation almost always turns to politics, right? But what if I told you the real story isn't about politics at all? Today, we're digging into the science, the core economic principles that actually turn these payments into a precision tool for managing the economy.
So that really gets us to the heart of it, doesn't it? Are these things just a random cash handout, or is there some real hard economic science behind it all? Well, as we're about to find out, the answer is actually way more precise than you might think.
All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll hit the core principle, that stimulus spark. Then we'll get into why targeting is so important. We'll take a quick look at the history, figure out the signs that tell us stimulus might be coming, and then we'll peek into the future of this whole thing.
Okay, let's dive right in with Section 1, the stimulus spark. To really get why these checks can pack such a punch, we have to understand this one single core economic idea that makes the whole thing work.
And that big idea is something called the marginal propensity to consume. Yeah, MPC for short. Look, I know it sounds super technical, but the concept is actually dead simple. Just ask yourself, if an extra dollar magically appeared in your hand right now, how much of it would you go out and spend versus how much would you stick in savings? That little percentage you'd spend, that's your MPC. And believe it or not, this one little idea is the engine that drives the entire stimulus strategy.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. That MPC number, it's not the same for everybody, not even close. The data is super clear on this. Lower income households are going to spend a huge chunk of any extra dollar they get. We're talking up to 90 cents of every dollar because, well, it has to go to essentials, right? Rent, groceries, gas. On the flip side, higher income folks tend to save a lot more of it. And that gap right there, that's the secret sauce for making stimulus work.
And look, this isn't just some dusty old economic theory. There's real-world proof. A study from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago actually found that people who had less than $500 in their bank account spent nearly half of their stimulus check in just 10 days. 10 days! That's a sky-high MPC in action, and that super fast spending is exactly the kind of fuel a struggling economy desperately needs.
So what happens when all that money gets spent so quickly? Well, it kicks off something economists get really excited about called the multiplier effect. I mean, think about it, right? The money you spend at the grocery store becomes income for the store, for the cashier, for the farmer who grew the food. And what do? They turn around and spend a piece of that money, and the cycle just keeps going and going. A high MPC from one group of people creates this powerful positive ripple that spreads through the whole economy.
Okay, so if the whole goal is to make that economic ripple as big as possible, how do you do it? How do you get the biggest splash? This brings us straight to our second section, targeting. Because, if you know who is most likely to spend the money, then you know exactly where to aim it. And this, of course, leads to one of the biggest debates in this whole thing. Should the stimulus be targeted or should it be universal? Look, sending a check to absolutely everyone is simple, I get it, but it's not very efficient because a ton of that money just gets tucked away into savings accounts by people who don't really need to spend it right away. But targeting the money specifically to those high MPC households, that ensures that almost every single dollar gets injected right back into the economy. You just get way more bang for your buck.
So, just how much bang for your buck are we really talking about? Well, the studies that looked at the targeted CARES Act are pretty jaw-dropping.
They basically found that for every single dollar the government put in, it generated about $1.50 in new economic activity. That's a 1.5x multiplier. That is an absolutely incredible return on investment, especially when the economy is on the ropes.
And this impact wasn't just some abstract number on a spreadsheet. It was deeply, deeply human. That same targeted approach is credited with lifting 11.7 million Americans out of poverty in 2020 alone. This is where the economic science really hits the street, you know? A policy that was designed for maximum economic boost also delivered direct, truly life-changing relief to millions.
All right, so it's pretty clear this isn't some brand new, untested idea. Let's take a quick look back at the history to see how this tool has been used time and time again. Actually, sending out these large-scale stimulus checks has become a pretty standard part of the modern playbook for fighting recessions. We saw it happen back in 2008 during the big financial crisis, and then boom, 3 more times during the COVID-19 pandemic. The strategy is really consistent. When the economy takes a nosedive, you get cash into the hands of the people who are going to spend it the fastest.
And you know what's truly remarkable? Just how fast it can happen. With the CARES Act, the very first direct deposit started hitting people's bank accounts just 2 weeks. 2 weeks after the bill was signed into law. That's proof positive that the government really does have the machinery to respond with incredible speed when a crisis demands it.
So looking at that history, you start to see a really clear pattern of response, right? So what are the signals? What are the economic warning signs that tell policymakers it might be time to pull this tool out of the toolbox again? You can basically think of these as the economy's red flags. When you start seeing a bunch of these pop up at the same time, like a sudden scary spike in unemployment, the whole economy shrinking instead of growing, or consumer confidence just falling off a cliff, that's when the people in charge start reaching for that stimulus playbook. These aren't just boring statistics, they're genuine distress signals.
And the 2020 recession, wow, that was a true perfect storm. It wasn't just one of these indicators flashing red. It was like they all went off at once. I mean, just look at unemployment. It went from a 50-year low to the highest it had been since the Great Depression in just 2 months. When all the alarms are screaming like that, the call for massive action, for something like stimulus checks, becomes pretty much impossible to ignore.
All right, this brings us to our final big question. We know what the triggers are, and we know this tool works. So, is there a better, smarter way to do this in the future?
And that's where this idea of automatic stimulus comes in. The whole point is to try and take the politics out of the equation. So instead of waiting for Congress to debate and fight and finally pass a new bill every single time a crisis hits, you'd have a system already in place where specific, pre-agreed upon economic triggers would, well, automatically send out the payments.
And the process itself would be incredibly straightforward. Lawmakers would agree on the triggers way ahead of time. Let's say, for example, if the national unemployment rate jumps by a certain amount in 3 months. Once that line is crossed, boom, the payments go out. No debate, no delay. The help arrives exactly when the economic data says it's needed most.
And the advantages to a system like this? They're huge. First, and most obviously, you get speed. You completely cut out all that legislative gridlock and delay. Second, you create certainty. Families and small businesses would know that a real safety net is already there, ready to catch them. And finally, you reduce the politicization of it all, making sure that critical relief isn't held hostage for political leverage.
So when you boil it all down, the key takeaway is really pretty simple. Stimulus checks aren't just random money drops. They are a proven tool of economic science. They're built on a predictable human behavior, that MPC principle, and they're activated by clear data-driven signals from the economy. And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. We know how stimulus works, and we know when it's needed. So the question for the future really is, could automating this relief fundamentally change how we respond to recessions? Could it make our economic safety net stronger, faster, and just plain more reliable for everyone? It's definitely something to think about.
All right, let's talk about something really fascinating in economics. It's called the multiplier effect. You ever get a payment, like a stimulus check, and wonder what happens to that money after you spend it? It doesn't just disappear, right? It actually sets off this incredible chain reaction. Your spending becomes someone else's paycheck, and then their spending becomes another person's paycheck, and on it goes. It's like dropping a stone in a pond and watching the ripple spread out. Today, we're going to unpack exactly how that works.
So let's just get right to the heart of it with a pretty wild question. How on earth can a single $1,400 check create, get this, nearly $2,500 in economic activity? I mean, that sounds completely impossible, right? Like some kind of financial wizardry. But I promise you, it's not magic. It's just math.
And by the time we're done here, you're going to see exactly how it all adds up.
So to really wrap our heads around this, we need to look at the process itself. It's basically an economic chain reaction. And that's the perfect way to describe it, because that's literally what happens. One person's spending triggers another person's, which triggers another. You get the idea. It just keeps building.
Okay, so the official fancy economist term for this whole thing is the multiplier effect. And the idea is super simple, really. When new money gets put into the economy, that first bit of spending, it doesn't just stop. Nope, it gets spent over and over and over again. And all those rounds of spending add up to a way bigger impact than that first dollar ever had on its own.
This is where it gets really clear. Let's just follow the journey of that stimulus check, step by step. So step 1, you get that $1,400. Cool. Now, you're probably not going to stick all of it under your mattress. You go out and spend some of it. Let's say about $630 on groceries or whatever. That's step 2. But here, this is where the magic starts. Your $630 doesn't just vanish. It becomes income for that supermarket. And what do? They use it to pay their workers and their suppliers. That's step 3. And now those people have new money. And guess what they do? They go out and spend a chunk of it too. That's step 4. And step 5, and the cycle just keeps on going, creating more and more economic energy with every single transaction.
So, after all those ripples, what's the final tally? Well, economists have crunched the numbers on this stuff for years, and what they've found is pretty amazing. For stimulus-type payments, every single dollar that's spent can end up generating somewhere between $1.20 and, believe it or not, $1.80 in total economic activity. Think about that. That one number, 1.8, really shows you the power of this whole chain reaction.
Okay, so how did they even figure that out? It's not just a guess. It actually comes down to some surprisingly simple math, and it all hinges on one little concept, a little acronym called MPC.
And here we are. MPC stands for Marginal Propensity to Consume. I know, it sounds super technical, but stick with me, it's actually really straightforward. All it means is, for every extra dollar you get, how much of it are you going to spend instead of save? That's it. If your MPC is, say, 0.50, that just means you spend 50 cents of that extra dollar. This one little number is the absolute engine behind the entire multiplier effect.
Let's put this into practice. Let's say the average MPC is 45%, or 0.45. So, round 1, you spend your $630. Now, the people who got that money, the store owners, the employees, they turn around and spend 45% of their new income. Boom. That's another $284 injected into the economy in round 2. And the people who get that money, they spend 45% of it, which is another $128 in round 3. You see how it works? Each wave gets a little smaller, but they just keep coming, and they all add up to create this massive economic impact from just one initial splash. Okay, now, nobody expects you to sit there with a calculator adding up a million little rounds of spending. Thank goodness for that, right? Economists have a super simple, clean formula for this. It's just 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC. That's it. It's so elegant, but man, is it powerful. So let's plug in that number we were just using, that 0.45 MPC. You do the math, 1 divided by 1 minus 0.45, and you get 1.82. Now this is like the perfect score, the theoretical maximum. It means in a perfect world, every dollar could create up to $1.82. Now in the real world, it's usually a bit less. That's because of stuff economists call leakages. Money that kind of leaks out of the system because it's saved or paid in taxes or spent on stuff from other countries. That money doesn't keep rippling through the local economy. But here's a really crucial point. The size of that economic wave, it's not the same for everyone. It actually depends big time on one thing. Who is getting the money? Because, let's be real, not everyone spends their money the same way. And that simple fact changes everything for policymakers.
And this chart right here tells the whole story. Just look at the difference. On the one end, you have low-income households. They have the highest MPC. They're spending about 40 to 45 cents of every extra dollar they get. Then you have middle-income folks, and then on the far end, high-income households who spend the least. And you might be asking, why is that? Well, it all boils down to simple, real-world necessity.
Now, this quote just hits the nail on the head. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, an extra $100 isn't going into an investment portfolio. No way. It's going straight to groceries, to keeping the lights on, to fixing the car so you can get to work. These aren't luxuries, they're immediate needs. And that spending goes right back into the community, creating a really powerful ripple.
On the flip side, someone who is already comfortable financially is just much more likely to save or invest that extra dollar, which doesn't fuel the immediate cycle in the same way.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting from a policy perspective. Check out this table. Let's compare two different ways to do a stimulus. First, a targeted plan, just for lower-income households. It costs about $42 billion. Because their MPC is so high, it creates almost $60 billion in economic impact. Now look at a universal plan that goes to everyone. It costs 5 times as much, but because it's also going to people who are more likely to save, the average MPC for the whole program is lower. So what's the bottom line? The targeted plan gives you way more bang for your buck. We're talking almost 4 times the economic impact for every single dollar the government spends. It's a huge lesson in economic efficiency.
All right, so that's the theory, that's the math. But the big question is, does this stuff actually work in the real world outside of a textbook? Absolutely. Let's take a look at a few times in recent history where the multiplier effect was a huge deal.
The data is pretty clear on this. Think back to 2008 and the Great Recession. Those tax rebates that went out, they helped stop the free fall in spending with a multiplier of about 1.2. The big stimulus package a year later, the ARA, had a similar impact. But the one we all remember is the 2020 CARES Act. Those direct checks caused a huge rebound in people's spending, with a multiplier that some economists think was as high as 1.5. So yeah, this isn't just theory. It's a real economic force with measurable results.
So what about today? What does this mean for the economy right now? Well, the thing about the multiplier effect is that its power isn't always the same. It can be stronger or weaker depending on what else is going on in the economy. So let's look at the kind of tug of war that's happening at this very moment.
So, on one side of the rope, you've got factors that make the multiplier even stronger. When the economy has some slack, people looking for jobs, factories with room to produce more, then a burst of new spending is a great thing. It puts all those unused resources to work. But on the other side of the rope, pulling against it, is inflation. When prices are already going up and the economy is running hot, just pumping more money in can be like throwing gasoline on a fire. Instead of creating more stuff, it can just make the stuff we have more expensive. And that, right there, is the huge challenge that policymakers are wrestling with.
And that brings us to the big final question we have to ask ourselves. We know the multiplier effect is this incredibly powerful tool to help an economy that's in a slump, no doubt about it. But what about now, in an era of high inflation? Does that powerful tool suddenly become a really big risk? How do you help people who are struggling without making inflation even worse for everybody? There's no easy answer, but it shows just how important it is to understand these deep economic forces that we've been talking about.
So, an economic crisis hits. The clock is officially ticking. You know the story. People are losing their jobs, businesses are scrambling, and everyone is looking for help. But that help, it often feels like it's completely stuck in traffic. What if we could put crisis relief on autopilot? That's the really fascinating idea we're diving into today. Automatic stimulus.
We've all been there, right? That feeling of anxiety during a downturn, just waiting for the government to do something. And this delay, it's not just frustrating, it has massive economic consequences. But to really get why this new idea is so powerful, we first have to understand the problem it's trying to solve.
I mean, it's the central question, isn't it? The economy is in a nosedive, and the response can feel painfully, agonizingly slow. And this isn't just how it feels. It's a real, well-documented problem in economic policy. They even have a name for it: the lag.
This timeline? Wow. It really puts the whole problem in perspective. Let's look at 2008. The recession officially started in December of 2007, but help didn't actually show up until May. Just think about that for a second. That's a 5-month gap where jobs were vanishing and the economic damage was just getting worse and worse. Now, even the much faster response during the COVID pandemic, which, was a huge effort, still took a full month to get aid out the door. The question is, can we do better?
This is where this idea of an economic autopilot comes into play. The goal here is pretty simple. Build a system that can react to a crisis practically instantly, without all the usual delays. Basically, putting the whole response on cruise control.
So how exactly would this autopilot work? Well, the best way to think about it is like an economic circuit breaker. It's a plan that's already approved, already sitting there waiting. And when the economy hits a specific danger zone, like say a sudden jump in unemployment, click, the breaker trips and relief starts flowing immediately. No new debates, no new votes, it just happens. And the logic behind it is actually incredibly simple, but really powerful. It's basically a 3-step process designed to take the politics out of the emergency responses. Here's the key. The debate over the triggers and the relief,
All of that happens before a crisis, when things are calm. That way, when the economic data confirms we're in trouble, the system just activates. The delays are gone.
And when you put the two approaches side by side like this, the difference is just stark. Our current system is this long marathon of debate, political battles, and delays. And all the while, families and businesses are just left waiting. The automatic approach, though, it turns that marathon into a sprint. It just gets rid of the hurdles right when speed matters most.
All right, so we've covered the how. Now let's get into the why. What are the really powerful arguments for adopting a system like this? Well, it pretty much all boils down to two huge benefits: speed and certainty.
Let's just go back to this number for a second, because it is so important. 5 months. In a recession, 5 months can literally be the difference between a small business staying afloat or closing its doors forever. It can be the difference between a family keeping their home or facing foreclosure. Speed isn't just a nice to have. It's an absolutely crucial factor in minimizing the real, human cost of a crisis.
And look, this isn't just some abstract economic theory. Research from big players like the Federal Reserve and the Brookings Institution is pretty clear on this. Getting money to people faster doesn't just feel better. It actually leads to shorter recessions, less long-term economic damage, and fewer people losing their jobs. Basically, getting money into the economy quickly helps stop the bleeding before the wound gets really, really bad.
So when you put it all together, the case is pretty compelling, right? You get speed, delivering aid right when it's needed most. You get certainty, which lets families and businesses plan instead of just panic. And maybe, just maybe, most importantly, by agreeing on the rules ahead of time, you take a lot of the political games out of a crisis, making the entire response more efficient.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. If the benefits are so obvious, why isn't this already the law everywhere? Well, like with any major change, there are some pretty big hurdles to clear, both in the technical design of the system and, of course, the political reality.
This is where the idea meets the cold, hard reality. A proposal like this one, the Automatic Boost to Workers Act, it looks simple enough on a slide. As unemployment gets worse, the payments go up. Makes sense. But oh man, the devil is in the details. How do you decide that 7% is the magic number to start? Is $1,000 the right amount? If you get these numbers wrong, you could either do way too little to help, or you could pour gasoline on an inflationary fire.
And that challenge of getting the numbers just right, that is just the tip of the iceberg. There are tons of other massive technical questions. Are you even tracking the right data to begin with? How do you build a system that won't trigger by mistake from a temporary blip in the data? And then, of course, there's the multi-trillion-dollar question. How do you actually pay for all of this in a way that's sustainable?
So, beyond just the design, there are these major economic and political worries. You've got the risk of inflation, you have serious questions about long-term debt, but honestly, the biggest slice of this chart, politically speaking, is often that loss of congressional control. Lawmakers are, let's say, very hesitant to give up their power over the purse strings, even if it's for a system that's designed to be way more efficient.
So yeah, there are some very real hurdles. But despite all of that, the conversation around automatic stimulus is definitely gaining steam. So let's look ahead a little bit at the potential future for this innovative and, kind of controversial idea.
And here's where things get really interesting. This isn't your typical left versus right issue. It's actually created this surprising alliance of supporters. On one hand, progressives see a system that guarantees rapid, reliable help for the most vulnerable people. And on the other, some conservatives see a way to create stability and certainty for businesses, and maybe even prevent even bigger, messier spending bills down the line.
You know, a huge reason this idea is even on the table right now is, well, it's technology. 20 years ago, trying to do this would have been a logistical nightmare. But today, we have access to way more real-time economic data, we have digital payment systems that can get money out almost instantly, and we have advanced analytics to help policymakers design smarter, better triggers. Technology is what's making this seem possible.
So what does the path forward actually look like?
Well, it's probably not going to happen overnight. It's likely to be a gradual process. Right now, we're in the debate and research phase. In the next few years, we might see some partial rollouts, maybe attaching automatic triggers to existing programs like unemployment insurance to test it out. And then way down the line, if those smaller experiments work out, we could see more comprehensive systems at the state or maybe even the federal level.
You know, ultimately, this quote really just nails it. The whole appeal of automatic stimulus is that it targets one of the oldest, most stubborn problems in all of economics, that huge, costly delay between seeing a problem and actually doing something about it. By pre-wiring our response, we might just be able to make our economy more resilient and our safety net way more reliable. Which leaves us with the final big question. It's the essential trade-off, isn't it? On one hand, we have this powerful potential tool for fighting recessions better than we ever have before. But it requires us to get the design absolutely perfect, and it requires politicians to willingly give up a bit of control. So, could an economic autopilot steer us safely through the next storm? Or are we better off keeping human hands on the wheel, even with all their built-in delays? That's the billion-dollar question we're all going to have to answer.
So you see the headlines, you hear all the talk on the news, but have you ever stopped to wonder how a stimulus check actually gets made? Well, it's definitely not magic. It's this high-stakes journey that starts with a big economic red flag and ends with money in your bank account. And today, we're going to break down every single step of that process. And really, getting a handle on this journey is so important. You'll see it's this whole process driven by economic alarms, huge political debates, and frankly, a massive logistical machine. Once you know how it all works, you'll be able to spot what's real and what's just noise, especially when it really counts. Okay, so here's the game plan. We're going to start with the crisis trigger that kicks everything off. Then we'll dive into the policy debates, follow a bill's journey into law, see how the money actually gets out the door, and wrap up by looking at lessons from the past. All right, let's jump into part 1, the trigger. Now, it's really important to get this straight. Stimulus action doesn't just happen on a whim. It's a direct response to some very specific and pretty serious economic warning signs that tell everyone, hey, the economy is in real trouble. So is there some kind of magic number that just flips a switch in Washington? Well, yeah, there kind of is, and it's this one right here, 8%. Historically, when the national unemployment rate hits 8%, that's the line in the sand. It's the point where the conversation completely shifts from, should we do something, to, okay, what are we going to do? It is the unmistakable signal of a major economic crisis. And just to put that 8% into perspective, take a look at this. A healthy, humming economy usually has an unemployment rate somewhere under 5.5%. So hitting 8%, that isn't just a bad month. No way. It's a fundamental break from the norm. It screams widespread economic crisis, and that's when you know a massive, coordinated response is on the table. But here's a really crucial part of the puzzle that you have to understand. There's always a delay. It's a concept called recognition lag. Basically, it can take anywhere from 1 to 3 months for all the data to come in, for experts to analyze it, and then for politicians to actually agree, yep, we're in a crisis. And that lag, that's exactly why stimulus help can feel like it's showing up late to the party, well after things have already gotten really tough for a lot of people. Okay, so once that alarm bell is finally ringing loud and clear, we move into the next phase, the big policy debate. This is where things get interesting, because even if everyone in Washington agrees there's a huge problem, they have very different ideas on how to fix it. And really, this debate boils down to 2 competing philosophies. On one side, you've got what's called the Keynesian approach. The idea here is simple: give money directly to people. Why? Because they'll go out and spend it, and that spending stimulates demand. Then, on the other side, you have the supply-side approach. This one argues for cutting taxes for businesses with the hopes that they'll use that money to invest, grow, and hire more people. Pretty much every stimulus package you ever see is some kind of mix and match compromise between these 2 big ideas. And it's so important to remember, direct checks, they're just one tool in a much bigger toolbox. At the same time, lawmakers are debating things like beefing up unemployment benefits, giving out tax rebates, or sending aid directly to state and local governments to prevent layoffs. The final bill is almost never just one single thing. It's always a carefully negotiated package with a little bit of everything. All right, so once they've hammered out some kind of general agreement, the idea has to go from just, a plan to an actual law. And that means it has to take a formal, very structured, and often pretty dramatic journey through the halls of Congress. Now, on paper, the path looks pretty straightforward, right? A bill gets introduced, it goes to a committee to get worked on, it gets voted on, and then it's off to the president. But even though those 4 steps are predictable, trust me, each one is a potential minefield where a bill can be totally changed, slowed down, or even killed off entirely. Okay, listen up. Because of all those steps, this one, the committee markup, is probably the most important one for your wallet. This is not just some boring procedural step. No, this is where the nitty-gritty details get decided. We're talking about the final dollar amount on that check, who exactly is eligible to get one, and what the income cutoffs are going to be. All that crucial stuff, it's decided right here. So, the bill is finally signed into law. Phew, the politicians' work is done. But you know what? The operational work is just getting started. Now begins the absolutely massive logistical challenge of taking the words on that paper and turning them into millions and millions of payments.
And the way they send the money out, it happens in these predictable waves. The very first wave, the fastest one, that's for everyone who has direct deposit set up with the IRS. Makes sense, right? Next up are federal beneficiaries, so people getting Social Security or VA benefits. And then the final wave is the paper checks being physically mailed out, which, as you can guess, takes the longest.
And you gotta realize, sending out millions of payments isn't a job for just one agency. It is a massive, coordinated mission. Think of the Treasury Department as the leader of the whole operation, but the IRS is the real powerhouse engine, and they have to work in perfect sync with other agencies like the Social Security Administration and Veterans Affairs just to get all the data right and push the money out.
So, a fair question to ask is, has this whole process actually gotten any better over the years? And the answer is a resounding yes. When you look back at past stimulus efforts, you see this really clear pattern of evolution. The government is absolutely getting faster and way more efficient each time they do this.
I mean, just look at this table. It tells a pretty amazing story. If we go back to 2008, it took about 3 months from the law being signed for the first payments to go out. 3 months! Now, fast forward to 2020 with the CARES Act, and that timeline shrank to just 2 weeks. Then, by 2021, with the American Rescue Plan, they got it down to an incredible 6 days. That's just wild.
That speed up, that's the real story here. That incredible leap from months down to just days is all thanks to technology and a huge push to get more and more people set up with direct deposit. I mean, think about it. What took basically a whole season to do back in 2008 can now be done in less than a week. It's a game changer.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap of the big takeaways. First, this whole journey starts with very clear economic triggers, like that 8% unemployment rate. Second, the size and type of help are shaped by those big policy debates. Third, the path through Congress is a pretty predictable 4-step process. And finally, and maybe most importantly, the whole system for getting the money out has gotten so much faster.
So why does any of this matter to you? Because when you understand this whole process, you can finally cut through all the noise and the rumors. You can actually tell the difference between a bill that's making real progress, moving through committees, heading for a vote, and one that's just a bunch of talk. It just makes you a smarter, more informed person.
So there you have it. We've seen the playbook. A crisis hits, a law gets hammered out, and the delivery gets faster and faster each time. The pattern is crystal clear, and you can see the system is constantly evolving. I guess the only question left for us to think about is, what will we learn for the next crisis?
All right, let's dive into an idea that is honestly pretty revolutionary. It's something that could completely change how we handle an economic crisis. We're talking about automatic stimulus, a way to get money to the people who need it right when they need it without all the political drama and delays that always seem to slow things down. So let's unpack how this could actually work.
But let's start with a question I think we've all asked ourselves. When the economy takes a nosedive and people are losing their jobs, why does it feel like it takes forever for any real help to show up? It's not just in our heads. It's a real, critical flaw in the system, and it has a massive human cost.
And that brings us right to our first topic, the stimulus waiting game. Look, the way we usually do things is just not built for speed. It has to go through Congress, there are endless debates, and then there's all the bureaucracy to actually get the money out the door. Every single one of those steps takes time, and it's precious time that a lot of families and small businesses just don't have. And we're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet here. These delays have devastating, real-world consequences. We saw it back in the 2008 financial crisis, and we absolutely saw it again during the COVID-19 pandemic. For every single week that help is delayed, you have more families facing eviction, you have more small businesses, the heart of our communities, having to close their doors for good, people get pushed into poverty, and that creates these deep, long-term economic scars that can last for years. This waiting game, it isn't just inefficient, it's incredibly painful.
Okay, so speed is a huge part of the puzzle, but the other part is effectiveness. And this brings us to the really cool science behind making stimulus actually work. It turns out it's not just about the total amount of money you pump into the economy. What's even more important is who you give that money to. This is where the science of spending gets really interesting.
The whole idea really hinges on this one key concept, the marginal propensity to consume,
or MPC. Now, I know it sounds a little academic, but the idea is actually super simple. It's just the measure of how much of each extra dollar a person gets they'll actually go out and spend versus how much they'll stick in a savings account. That's it. And this one little number is basically the engine that powers the entire economic impact of a stimulus plan.
And this chart, it shows you everything you need to know. After looking at over 1,000 studies, economists have found this super consistent pattern. Lower income households have an MPC of about 0.45. That means for every extra buck they get, they spend about 45 cents of it right away. Now, look over at the higher income households. Their MPC is way down around 0.20. They only spend about 20 cents of that extra dollar. That difference is absolutely massive, and it's the key to this whole thing.
So why is there such a huge gap? Well, this quote right here just nails it. If you're struggling to make ends meet, an extra dollar isn't just a number, right? It's food on the table, it's keeping the heat on, it's fixing the car so you can get to work. That money has to go right back into the economy. And that spending becomes income for a local business, which then pays an employee who then goes out and spends it too. That's the famous multiplier effect we always hear about, and it all starts by getting money to the people who will spend it immediately. So this leads us to the two big ways you can do stimulus. On one side, you've got the targeted approach. You can think of this like a laser beam. It sends money directly to the households with the highest MPC, making sure you get the absolute biggest economic bang for your buck. Then you have the universal approach. This is more like a fire hose, just spraying money everywhere. Yeah, it hits everyone, but the average MPC is way lower because a lot of wealthier folks will just save it, and saving doesn't really boost the economy in the short term. So the targeted approach is just way more efficient.
And the math on this is just, well, it's not even a debate. Let's look at what's happened in the past. If you send checks to 30 million low-income families, you get a certain amount of economic stimulus. Cool. Now, what if you wanted to get about 3 times that boost using a universal plan? Well, you'd have to send checks to 150 million people. So think about that. You're spending 5 times the money just to get 3 times the impact. It makes the targeted plan more than 3 times more cost-effective. It's not politics, it's just how the numbers work.
Okay, so we've established that stimulus needs to be fast and it needs to be targeted. But how in the world do you solve that first problem? The gridlock, the delays, the politics. Well, this is where the really brilliant part of the idea comes in. An automatic trigger, a system that takes the decision away from politicians and puts it in the hands of cold, hard data.
And that trigger has a name, the SOM rule, named for the economist Claudia Somm. It is so elegant because it's so simple. Here's how it works. You find the lowest point the 3-month average unemployment rate hit in the last year. If that average ever climbs half a percentage point above that low, the rule triggers. That's it. And why that specific number? Because when you look back over decades of data, that little half a point jump has been an incredibly accurate signal that a recession is starting. It's not a guess, it's based on a clear historical pattern.
And here's what the creator herself had to say about it. Claudia Somm's goal was super clear. Build something that acts fast, something that could get out ahead of a recession, soften the landing, and get real help to families who are just starting to hurt. So the point wasn't just to make a clever economic graph, it was to build a tool that actually helps people.
So let's just walk through how this would play out in the real world. Step 1. The latest unemployment data comes out and boom, it shows the 3-month average has ticked up by that critical half a percentage point. Step 2. Instantly, with no debate, no vote, nothing, the SAM rule is triggered. And then, step 3. The system is authorized to immediately start sending targeted payments directly to households, probably based on income data the government already has. The whole thing is clean, direct, and incredibly fast.
So when you put all these pieces together, the speed of that automatic trigger, plus the efficiency of targeted payments, what you're really building is a modern economic safety net. This isn't just a small change to the system. It's a fundamental upgrade to how we provide security for everyone in the country.
And the benefits here are they're huge. Economic models suggest a system like this could literally reduce the severity of a recession by up to 40%. By getting that money out the door, it could speed up the entire recovery by months. It keeps people spending, which breaks that awful cycle where job losses lead to less spending, which then leads to more job losses. And beyond all the data, it gives families some peace of mind, knowing that if things go south, help is coming, automatically. And maybe best of all, it yanks emergency aid out of the political mud wrestling pit.
So, why is this so important to talk about right now? Well, even though the economy has been surprisingly tough, the warning lights are definitely blinking. Major forecasters like JP Morgan are putting the odds of a recession by the end of 2025 at around 40%.
Now, nobody knows for sure, but the risk is definitely higher than usual. This makes the conversation about building a smarter, faster system feel a lot more urgent.
And that leaves us with this one big final question. We've seen the terrible human cost of doing things too slowly. We get the science behind why targeting works so much better, and we have a clear data-driven plan to make it all automatic. So is it possible that our best defense against the next recession isn't some complex, drawn-out political battle, but just a simple, elegant math rule? It's definitely something worth thinking about.
Have you ever wondered how a decision about something as huge as a stimulus check actually gets made? Well, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and really decode the whole process, not by looking at rumors, but by looking at the hard data. Okay, let's just get it out there. This is the question, right? Is another stimulus check coming? You see it everywhere. Headlines, social media. It's this total storm of speculation. One article says yes, for sure. The next one says no way. It's confusing. So what's the real story? So here's the key, the thing I really want you to take away today. Stimulus checks are not random. Not at all. They're actually pretty predictable, data-driven responses to very specific things happening in the economy. Think of it like a fire alarm that only goes off when certain sensors get triggered. And today, we're going to learn how to read those sensors for ourselves. Let's dive right in. The best way to think about this is that policymakers have a kind of economic dashboard right in front of them with all these key warning lights. When enough of those lights start flashing red, that's when they know they have to act. We're going to start with the most important one on the whole dashboard. This right here is the big one. Seriously. More than any other number, the unemployment rate tells the story of widespread economic pain. When the percentage of people who want a job, who are actively looking for one, but just can't find one, starts to climb, that is the most reliable trigger for government action. Period. And if you look back at history, you can see these really clear lines in the sand. When unemployment is in that healthy zone, below roughly 5.5%, stimulus isn't even part of the conversation. But once it creeps into that concern area, let's say 6 to 7%, you can bet that people in Washington are starting to have some very serious talks. And if it jumps into that crisis zone, 8% or higher, well, that's when history shows us that major stimulus action almost always follows. 14.7%. Just let that number sink in. That was the peak unemployment rate back in April 2020, and it had skyrocketed from just 3.5% only 2 months earlier. A jump that massive, that fast, is basically a 5-alarm fire for the economy. And it's that exact number that directly led to the massive CARES Act stimulus package. Okay, so our next warning light on the dashboard is gross domestic product, or what you always hear called GDP. If the unemployment number tells us about the health of the workforce, GDP tells us about the health of the entire economy. So when GDP starts to shrink, that's another huge red flag for policymakers. Negative 31.4%. I mean, wow. That was the annualized rate that GDP fell in the second quarter of 2020. The economy didn't just slow down, it completely fell off a cliff. A contraction that severe is like the economy having a heart attack. It signals that spending has just stopped, and that demands a massive response from the government. So our third indicator is the Consumer Confidence Index. And this one is so important because consumer spending, me and you buying stuff, drives about 70% of the U.S. economy. It's the engine. So if people lose confidence and stop spending, the whole system can just grind to a halt. A sharp drop here can actually predict a downturn before it even shows up in the other data. When you're looking at this index, anything over 100, that's strong. People are feeling good. But the real number to watch is 80. When confidence dips below 80 and just stays there, it's a sign of some deep worry out there. People start saving their money instead of spending it, which can create this self-fulfilling prophecy of an economic slowdown. Just look at 2008 for a perfect example. Right before that stimulus package was passed during the financial crisis, consumer confidence absolutely cratered. It fell by 42%. When public sentiment plunges like that, it creates immense political pressure on lawmakers to do something. So, okay, we've got our economic warning lights. But the economy doesn't exist in a bubble, right? To really get the full picture, we have to look beyond just the data and talk about the political factors that decide if and when a stimulus actually happens. Have you ever noticed this pattern? The 2008 stimulus passed just 9 months before a presidential election.